81. Author's note on launch. The Taiwan novel site is super convenient. C. Enjoy it anytime. TLDR, I'll release 10 chapters on launch day. Updates will start at midnight and be completed within 24 hours. I'll be writing and posting them as I go. Details. I'm very sorry about getting the launch date wrong earlier. The launch is on the 4th. To make up for it, I'll do a mass update. I don't have enough banked chapters yet, so I'll need to write on the 4th to make this happen. After the launch day, I'll try to squeeze in a few extra chapters if I can, and then I'll fix the regular update time at 8 a.m. sharp. Thank you all for your continued support. I honestly didn't expect such a warm reception, and I'm full of gratitude and a little nervousness. I promise I'll write from the heart to repay everyone. Rewards and extra chapters. After launch, I'll add 1 extra chapter for every 500 monthly votes. Donations earn extra chapters too. A League Leader donation will add 10 extra chapters. A Silver donation adds 20 chapters, and I can't even imagine what a Gold donation would bring. A final word, I plan to write full-time. If I don't write well, I won't get by, so please rest assured that I'll treat the story and its future chapters with care. I'm asking, really begging, for your subscriptions and support. Thank you all again. Chapter 82. Please come in. I've been saving up drafts. Tonight at midnight, I'll post 10 explosive chapters, plus 10 bonus chapters to make up last month's owed monthly vote bonus, 20 chapters in total. Thank you, dear readers, for your ongoing support. Things are going well, and I'll keep working hard to write a story that lives up to your affection and support. Also, please remember to vote and subscribe this month. Thank you all. Oars. Chapter 81. Small Classes. After curfew, the castle fell completely silent. Regulus wrapped himself in a disillusionment charm and slipped out of the Slytherin common room. The corridor was empty, the portraits were asleep, and the suits of armor stood motionless. Only the torches burned, throwing flickering shadows. He deliberately opened and spread his magical sense, letting it reach outward and pick up every trace of the unusual in the air. At the same time, his spatial awareness activated, and the structures within range were presented clearly in his mind. Every crack, every nook, even the vortices of moving air. There were no house elves and no other signs of surveillance. Regulus wasn't surprised. Dumbledore's watch might be sporadic rather than constant. Maybe there was no schedule tonight, or the house elf was elsewhere. Either way, it was acceptable. He walked to the entrance of the library. Madame Pince's desk was empty, and he moved familiarly to the restricted section, heading to the shelf on soul studies. He pulled down a book, Soul Resilience, on resisting Imperio and bewitchment. He read in his usual thorough way. The book's description of defense against Imperio was conventional. Imperio forcibly overwrites the target's will with the caster's own, making the victim unable to tell which thoughts are theirs. Defense, it said, was strengthening one's will and building protections. Regulus thought further. During the Christmas break, Orion had used Imperio to test his mental strength. He'd resisted it, relying on the tenacious will forged by star orbit meditation and the thought mazes of occlumency. But after resisting, Regulus had entertained a different idea. Imperio is an overwrite. What if you took another tack? Not overwriting at once, not blunt suppression, but replacement. If the target's will were a fortress, Imperio sent an army to seize the fortress, kill the garrison, and plant its own flag. That violent conquest met resistance and could fail. But what if instead one sent architects, craftsmen, civil servants, or spies to infiltrate slowly, alter the structure of the fortress, replace key personnel, and imperceptibly make the place one's own? By the time the target noticed, it would be too late. That would no longer be simple Imperio. It would be a subtler, more advanced form of mental control. It would require immense mental power, precise operation, and deep knowledge of the target's mental architecture. Theoretically feasible, especially against those with weak wills or mental vulnerabilities. Regulus closed the book and let his magical awareness recede. The idea was interesting, but, for now, just a fantasy. His mental strength wasn't nearly enough. His understanding of inner structure was almost nil, and precise manipulation was out of reach. Still, it offered a direction. Once his star orbit meditation progressed, if he lit the 5th star and beyond, his mental power might improve qualitatively. Then he could try it, starting with simple targets, perhaps animals, and working up. He paused on the thought of animals. Would small animals transform from wizards' work? Human transfiguration wouldn't, but an animagus might. An animagus could risk being influenced by animal instincts. A little mouse would be convenient. Peter, keep it up, he thought, half to himself. Regulus browsed other forbidden volumes. Every visit to the restricted section reminded him how much treasure Hogwarts held. It was nearly 2 in the morning when he returned to the Slytherin dormitory. Avery and Alex were asleep, their even breathing behind the bed curtains. Hermes's bed was empty. The curtains were drawn tight with no one inside. Regulus washed and lay down. Hermes had been absent from the dormitory more often than anyone else, even more than Regulus, who tended to wander at night. Last semester, Hermes still came back to sleep each night. This semester, he was frequently gone through the night. Regulus no longer followed the small circle either. Avery had already told him he was angry with Hermes, considering leaving the group a betrayal. Alex had no opinion and was even vaguely pleased. The gloomy boy had never been much liked. Slytherin always had cliques, some by blood, some by shared interests. Many upper years were unified by Lord Voldemort's philosophy. Once they graduated, they'd don black robes and silver masks and devote themselves to the cause. Regulus didn't care about that. He thought about Hermes. Had Hermes's mission entered a critical phase? He remembered what he'd found last term: cursed books, empty glass bottles, maps marking secret spots in the castle, scorch marks and the smell of sulfur on Hermes sometimes. Hermes was searching for something, or carrying out some family duty. As long as it didn't affect Regulus, he wouldn't interfere. Everyone had secrets, but he'd keep watching. Hermes was useful and worth bringing along at the right moment. He'd shown power last term, but it wasn't enough yet. Regulus closed his eyes and sank into star orbit meditation. 4 silver stars lit in the dark, outlining the contours of his inner landscape. His magical sense circulated along the astral tracks, easing the day's fatigue and lightening his mental load. Sleep followed. On a Friday afternoon in late January, the Charms classroom was half empty. Professor Flitwick had officially invited Regulus to an advanced Charms seminar that in practice consisted only of Regulus and a few upperclassmen. Regulus knew it was a Hogwarts tradition. Professors invited truly talented young wizards for individual instruction. He accepted gladly. If Flitwick had called him over, perhaps Professor McGonagall wouldn't be far behind. He'd even prepared questions for her. Flitwick stood on a stack of books with only 5 students before him: 3 7th years, 2 Ravenclaws and a Hufflepuff, and a 6th-year Gryffindor, all sitting in the front row with quills and parchment ready. Regulus sat in the second row by the window. The seat beside him was empty. The upperclassmen glanced his way now and then with polite curiosity. They didn't treat him oddly for being a first year. In fact, Regulus had a reputation. "Today's subject isn't in the syllabus," Flitwick said, his voice softer than in regular class but unusually intense. "Emotional resonance in spells, how a caster's mental state affects the magic's outcome." He raised his wand. "Take the levitation charm," he said. With a light flick, the quill on the podium rose, floating steadily and stopping in midair. The pen bobbed gently, like a dandelion seed in a breeze. Its ascent was slow and soft, with a slight pause at the apex. "When I cast that," Flitwick said, "I was thinking of lightness, of joy, like seeing a butterfly for the first time in spring. Now," he waved his wand again. The quill dropped back to the table. He cast the charm a second time. This time the quill shot upward with a whoosh, twice as fast as before, its tip pointing down, and it stopped 30 centimeters above the desk, perfectly still. The pen didn't sway at all. The ink sac cast a thin, long shadow in the sunlight. "This time I was thinking of responsibility," Flitwick said, watching the quill. "It must float. It must be steady. It must be accurate." Regulus watched the quill and felt the difference. The magical intensity was similar, but the texture of the magic differed. The first charm's flow was gentle and even. The second was taut and focused. Both achieved levitation, but by different means. "Spells are written down," Flitwick went on. "Gestures, incantations, magical energy, these are in textbooks. But wizards aren't magical machines. We have emotions, moods, and thoughts in that instant, and those seep into the magic and affect the spell." A 7th-year Ravenclaw raised his hand. Professor, can you measure this influence? Can it be quantified? It's difficult, Flitwick admitted. Everyone's emotions are different, and the same person's emotions change over time. But what's certain is that mental state alters the texture of the spell. Regulus felt an idea rise and raised his hand. Mr. Black? Professor? He asked politely. The incantation and gestures are fixed, but the caster's internal state changes the magic's effect. Is there a pattern to that change? Can it be deliberately controlled and reproduced? Flitwick looked at him with serious interest. You mean by manipulating your own state to steer a spell's effect? Yes, Professor. Regulus nodded. The same levitation charm, cast with different mental states, shows perceptible differences in trajectory and result. Does this come from the caster's state infusing the magic? If so, what mechanism causes that infusion? Could you train a specific internal state so it becomes a stable, callable casting condition? The room fell quiet. Flitwick breathed slowly. You've touched on an advanced topic, he said gravely. The spell itself defines what can be done. The wizard's mind defines how it's done. Professor Dumbledore studied this deeply in his youth. He called it the resonance between mental imagery and magic. Regulus listened quietly. He knew the Patronus. Theoretically, any spell can be permeated by one's internal state, Professor Flitwick said, echoing Regulus's words. But this permeation is mostly unconscious and fluid and hard to capture. Trying to deliberately control it is dangerous. Forcibly twisting your inner state to suit a spell can lead to unexpected changes in the magic. It might improve the effect, or it might ruin it. If it's bad enough, it can even cause damage at the soul level. But it isn't impossible, Regulus said. Flitwick looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Not impossible, only treacherous. Many wizards in history have tried. Some succeeded, some went mad, and more were left halfway, never again able to find that pure, unconscious state when casting. Regulus nodded, thoughtful. He knew how the killing curse demanded an absolute will to kill, how Crucio required a desire to inflict pain, how Imperio needed a drive to dominate. The darker the emotion, the greater the power. That was the basic logic of the dark arts. Flitwick's voice dropped, his eyes serious. Dark magic was not a forbidden topic among older students. Few young wizards were completely untouched by it. Many dark arts require strong negative emotions: anger, hatred, fear, pain, Flitwick continued. Those emotions complete the magic. The stronger the negativity, the stronger the spell. And the stronger the spells become, the more they feed those negative emotions in return. He looked around at the class, earnest and warning. For those who pursue power in the dark arts, this is a dangerous cycle. Once they find a way to grow stronger, they'll use every means to deepen their negativity, deliberately creating pain, amplifying hatred, immersing themselves in darkness. And in the end, he paused and shook his head. In the end, there is not a single positive feeling left in their minds. People become more extreme, more warped, and when the dark arts reach a certain depth, they can turn and erode the very practitioner. It's not that they can't turn back, it's that they don't even know they need to. Flitwick's warning was clear. He meant to protect Regulus from the seductive slide into darkness, losing oneself to the dark arts. But Regulus's thoughts went elsewhere. What if you replaced dark arts with white magic? If someone became absolutely convinced they were entirely right, that their justice was supreme, that all opponents were evil, how different is that extreme positivity from extreme negativity? Both are willing to sacrifice everything for a goal, including reason and empathy. People are rarely afraid of extreme positivity because it usually appears wrapped in kindness, justice, and protection. In essence, extremes are extremes. Society simply puts a gold label on those it agrees with and a pejorative on those it fears. He remembered a passage from a book he'd read. Some powerful, mentally steady dark wizards could use dark magic without being consumed. Regulus even thought it possible they weren't resisting the magic's erosion so much as refusing to take it on as anything special. Magic was just a tool. The corruption came from the practitioner's own wavering and indulgence. If a person's mind is firm, if they know what they are doing and why, and can bear the consequences, does it matter which spells they use? Dumbledore had studied the dark arts when he was younger, and Grindelwald had been a master of them. At that level, the distinction between dark and light blurred. What affected them was not the magic itself, but the purpose behind it and the philosophy that drove them. As for Lord Voldemort, he was hardly worth considering. Regulus checked himself. He was far from that level. For now, he simply believed magic was a tool. Good and evil lay in the choices and consequences of the user. After class, Flitwick kept him behind. "Your thoughts are interesting," the professor said, eyes bright behind his glasses. "Keep thinking. But remember, theory is one thing, practice another. The mind is a subtle thing. Forced manipulation can backfire." "I understand, Professor," Regulus replied, nodding respectfully. The lesson hadn't been new to him, but he appreciated the warning. It was well meant, and it served as a reminder. Afterward, Regulus went straight to the room of requirement. The training room was empty. The wooden floor gleamed under soft magical lights. He sat cross-legged in the center and began to think. What is the imagery of the starry sky? What vocabulary could evoke it? Calm, vast, grand, eternal. If he could inject that image as a stable mental setting into a spell, he raised his wand and pointed at a training dummy. Protego. A silver-white shield appeared in front of the dummy, a standard shield charm, evenly cast. Regulus closed his eyes and let the star orbit meditation run, feeling the 4 focus points in his mind light up. He didn't want a particular constellation now. He wanted the feeling. Distant starlight traveling across light years, arriving cold and steady, the majesty of the universe, the sense of eternity and order in which all things follow natural laws. He filled his mind with that image, not an emotion, but a cognitive understanding. Time is immense, he is small, and yet his small self still thinks and exists. He cast the charm again. This time the barrier was different. Its color was deeper, a silver gray with faint, almost invisible rings of starlight on the surface. The texture felt denser and more solid, like bedrock compressed over billions of years, tightly structured and hard to dislodge. Magical consumption had increased by about 15%. Regulus dispelled the shield, walked to the dummy, and touched where the barrier had been. A faint trace of magic lingered in the air. The starry texture had a residual warmth, like the embers of a fire just gone out. It worked. Although it cost more and required deep meditation to invoke the image, it was feasible. This was cognitive resonance, using rational cosmic imagery as the backdrop for spellcasting rather than relying on raw emotion. Regulus made a mental note of the discovery. It was only a beginning, but it suggested a direction. Perhaps the imagery of falling stars could stiffen attack spells, the image of gravitational fields could enhance restraints, or the imagery of life arising in space might boost healing magic. Magic was remarkable. No, magic had always been remarkable. By the last week of January, Hogwarts was wrapped in a gray hush. Students still ran in corridors, cutlery still clashed in the Great Hall, and professors still taught, but for Regulus, a particular dissonance had vanished. The provocations and petty conflicts of the previous term had not recurred this month. Slytherin was unusually calm. Upper-year students nodded as they passed, younger ones gave way, and even the pureblood heirs who loved to stir trouble seemed to have learned manners, at least where he was concerned. Regulus knew why. His public appearance at the Malfoy family Christmas banquet had signaled something. Many pureblood families had likely told their children, "Don't provoke him, at least not now." But he also knew this wouldn't last. Pureblood upbringing taught an ugly logic. Status depends on contest, relationships on maneuvering. Peace was a truce. Conflict was the norm. Some might even think that Lord Voldemort preferred internal competition among his followers, kept them checking and balancing one another, easier to control. So sooner or later someone would act. Maybe they wouldn't be powerful enough to defeat him. No one at Hogwarts seemed so gifted. But someone would show an attitude. Our family isn't afraid of Black. We dare to provoke him. Or worse, they might think creating conflict would curry favor with the Dark Lord. Regulus waited, unhurried. What was coming would come. Chapter 83. Ideological Infiltration. Wednesday afternoon, Regulus sat in the Slytherin common room with a book in his lap. The fire burned bright in the grate, and the silver and green decor threw a cool sheen over the flickering flames. A couple of second years were playing wizard's chess in the corner. The crack of snapping pieces underscored the murmured conversations of a few seventh years on the sofa, worrying over exams. Regulus was in an armchair by the window, staring at advanced transfiguration principles. He noticed movement at the portrait hole and looked up. Severus Snape stood framed in the doorway, his silhouette like a pooled shadow. He didn't come in, he only lingered, eyes fixed on Regulus. Regulus met his gaze. Snape gave the smallest of nods, almost imperceptible, then turned and left the room. Regulus closed his book and rose to follow. The corridor was empty. Snape waited in the shadows around the corner, leaning against the cold stone, fingers unconsciously fiddling at his side. "Black," he said, voice low. "Snape," Regulus answered, his own tone colder still. After a brief greeting, Snape stepped out of the gloom. He darted a quick look down the corridor in both directions to make sure no one else was nearby before he spoke. "The upper years, the atmosphere isn't right." Regulus waited. "There have been gatherings these last few weeks." Snape's words were cautious. He glanced again along the corridor and then continued, quieter still. "Not public, small classrooms, empty rooms on the 8th floor. I'm half-blood, so I wasn't meant to be there, but someone vouched for me." He hesitated, as if deciding how much to say. "Professor Slughorn mentioned my skill with potions. A few of the 7th years heard about it. They needed someone to process certain materials, so they asked for help. In return, they let me sit in." Regulus nodded. It made sense. In their circles, talent could trump pedigree when it was useful. "And what are they talking about?" he asked. Snape's voice dropped. "Cleaning up the trash." Regulus repeated the word silently. He didn't need the translation. Trash. Mudbloods, Muggle-borns, those who supposedly sullied the pure bloodline. "Do they have a concrete plan?" "Not yet." Snape shook his head. "It's more an atmosphere than a plan. There's talk of doing something big. The language is getting more radical, the attitudes more fanatical. Some of them say they have support at home. Some talk about a higher will." "A higher will," Lord Voldemort, Regulus thought. "Are they planning action at Hogwarts?" "Possibly." Snape's nod was uncertain. Or maybe it's preparation. Cultivating an attitude, shaping thought. So when they graduate and finally join up, they'll already be obedient soldiers. Regulus pictured them, 16, 17-year-old pure-blood children, drowned in family glory and doctrines of blood purity, spoon-fed Voldemort's ideas until they believed they were on a sacred mission, to purge and purify the magical world. Fanaticism spread easily in a closed room. Once a person subsumed their identity in the group, responsibility and individual morality diluted into the group will. The more extreme the group will became, the more ordinary boys would do things they never would alone, convinced that the cause justified them. "Why tell me?" Regulus asked at last. Snape pressed his lips together. After a long moment, he said simply, "Evans." "Lily Evans, Muggle-born, Gryffindor. Would she be a target?" "Not necessarily today. But if this atmosphere continued, Muggle-borns would increasingly be treated as enemies, and words could harden into actions, harassment, sabotage, open attacks. Snape didn't seem motivated by a general concern for Muggle-borns. He had been in the middle of these attitudes and could easily have become swept up by them himself. He cared about Lily. He also knew he could not protect her alone. He needed allies with influence and status to intervene. Regulus Black fit that description. The heir of the Black family, one of the Sacred 28, with talent and standing in Slytherin. And as a reminder of the last Christmas exchange made clear, Regulus understood reciprocity. "The recipe last time was very useful," Snape added, staring at Regulus as if explaining. "And that, dark arts work, helped me see certain things." He was currying favor and trading information for more knowledge and resources. Regulus could see the nervous hope in him and inclined his head. "I'll keep an eye on it. Let me know if anything more concrete comes up. As for payment, you know the standard." Snape's expression lit with something like relief for a moment before shadowing again. "Understood?" He hesitated then, voice barely audible. "Evans?" Regulus looked at him calmly, unreadable. Snape waited, ready to leave, until Regulus gave the tiniest of nods, just enough to be seen. Gratitude and awkwardness flickered across Snape's face. He said nothing more and left. Regulus stood there for a while, thinking. Something was stirring among Slytherin's older students. It might not yet be action. It seemed more like ideological preparation. Voldemort didn't only need thugs, he needed believers, soldiers with loyalty forged by conviction. Hogwarts was the perfect breeding ground, Slytherin the testing ground. If pure-blood children could be taught these ideas while still at school, they would graduate ready-made for recruitment. Ideological infiltration was far more dangerous than outright violence. Violence draws notice, provokes opposition, and invites intervention from Dumbledore and the Ministry. Subtle indoctrination, however, was slow and almost invisible, like a frog in boiling water. By the time anyone realized what had happened, a whole generation of purebloods might have accepted the logic. Regulus decided to observe rather than intervene. It wasn't his responsibility. He wasn't a crusader for justice. So long as none of it threatened him, he would let it unfold, at least for now. But he would watch. Information was power. Knowing what the enemy thought and planned was always preferable to ignorance. He returned to his armchair, the book open on his lap, though his eyes didn't track the lines. His intervention during the recent Quidditch disturbance had been deliberate, a performance meant to show certain qualities to any observers: Dumbledore, Voldemort, rival pureblood families. Calm control in a crisis, the ability to stabilize a volatile situation, these were leadership qualities. Voldemort might want muscle, but he also needed organizers who could manage that muscle. A Black who could command and keep order would be far more valuable than one who merely rushed into battle. What Snape reported now, however, was different. Not a one-off display, but a slow, generational influence forming in Slytherin. When he was done thinking, Regulus went to the room of requirement. The training room materialized, and he stood in the center, a small silver sickle in his palm. He practiced spatial warp. His perception stretched outward, and the room's spatial structure resolved into a grid in his mind. Nodes and vectors, the sickle's origin point clear and distinct. He directed his intent, channeled his magic along the room's texture, and guided the object. The sickle vanished and reappeared on the floor 3 meters away. Regulus walked over. The landing point was about 40 centimeters off his intended spot, an improvement from the 50-centimeter error last time. The metal felt warm to the touch, a residue of spatial friction. Progress, greater distance, tighter control, and though the energy cost hadn't fallen, his precision had improved. He picked up the sickle and slipped it into his pocket. The Blacks were wealthy, but Regulus wasn't wasteful. Regulus walked to the corner of the room where several items had been laid out: a palm-sized stone, a glass bottle, and an old key. They were his practice props for the space anchor charm. The inherited knowledge had finally been fully assimilated. He understood the principles now and had built a coherent mental framework. It was like running a library in his head. Each branch of magic had its own section, and every spell its place. Natural magic, space magic, transfiguration theory, the dark arts, the basics, everything had cross-references and passages linking them. It wasn't some fanciful mind palace, just efficient information management. Categorize the vast, complicated knowledge, set up connections, and retrieval became instant instead of a fumbling search. Like a potion cupboard where every ingredient sits in an assigned slot, ready to be taken without rummaging. The system needed upkeep. New knowledge had to be filed, old entries corrected, but the payoff was enormous. Where recalling a spell used to require a slow search through memories, now he only needed to go to the right shelf in his head and the details surfaced. He closed his eyes, sank his consciousness inward, and then opened them again and lifted his wand. Magic flowed from the tip and coalesced into an invisible point in the air about half a meter in front of him. The anchor point formed. It couldn't be seen, but he could feel it. The spatial structure at that spot had been pinned down and stabilized. He cast a levitation charm toward the anchor's location. The spell took effect, but its force was diminished. The object rose more slowly, about a third less speed, and it trembled as it passed near the anchor. Success. The anchor point could interfere with local spatial geometry, and so indirectly affect any magics that relied on spatial stability. Apparition, portkeys, even the transmission paths of ordinary spells could be disturbed by passing through such a point. Keeping an anchor required a continuous drain of magical energy. Right now, Regulus could sustain at most 3 anchors at once, each lasting about 10 minutes. In a real fight, he would have to choose whether to invest his power in anchors or in direct offensive spells. It would take more practice to find the balance. He dispelled the anchor and moved to his meditation circle. Star orbit meditation came online, and 4 stars lit in his consciousness. He felt the cold of starlight, spanning billions of light years, the slow drift of constellations, and the vast contrast with his own smallness. Then he whispered the incantation, Incendio. With a slight flick of his wrist, his wand painted an arc. In his mind, he called up a supernova, the last, blinding glory of a dying star, an instant release of more energy than its whole lifetime had held. White-hot flames erupted from the wand's tip. They were not ordinary orange fire, but incandescent, sizzling in the air. The blast was not a narrow jet, but an explosive dispersal. The flames hit the training dummy. The leather surface carbonized and blackened instantly, but instead of a slow burn, the heat burned clean through. A neat, fist-sized hole appeared in the dummy's chest. The wood behind had been reduced to ash, and the room felt oppressively hot. The spell had consumed 3 times the usual magical energy of a standard fire-making charm. Regulus lowered his wand and stared at the hole. The power was terrifying, impressive, but the cost was enormous. 3 times the consumption made it far less practical than a simple protego in most confrontations. It was usable only under deep meditation and with great expense of power. Still, the result proved a point. Blending vivid emotional imagery with precise, rational spellwork could warp and amplify a spell's effect. He only needed more practice to find the trade-off between power and cost, and to learn how fast and how deeply to evoke the imagery. He sat and thought about the inheritance he had just digested. Those crystal spheres had not merely poured facts into him. They had transmitted distilled magical insight, lived experience, and pieces of a soul imprint. Preparing such an inheritance required immense magical skill and soul strength. Someone had to compress the essence of a life's learning into crystal and seal it so a successor could receive it safely. Not every family could do that. The House of Black's long history and deep resources explained why it possessed several such inheritances. Other families might have one, or might not. If they did, it would be a closely guarded secret. His own families had been concealed from him until he discovered it. Trying to acquire another family's inheritance was nearly impossible unless the family had been destroyed or someone forced it from them. A powerful wizard like Voldemort could certainly compel a house to hand over its heirlooms. Who would dare refuse? The thought crossed Regulus's mind. If he ever needed another family's inheritance, how would he get it? Coercion, temptation, trade, or waiting for a voluntary gift? He didn't know. For now, he had many avenues to pursue power. The Black family's inheritances, the Hogwarts library, the professor's guidance, and his own research and practice. He wondered, too, what he might one day leave behind for his house. He was only 12. His path had just begun. If he grew powerful, perhaps he would create a new kind of legacy rather than repeating his ancestors' footsteps. He pushed open the Room of Requirements door. The castle corridors were empty and sleeping. The relief of having finished digesting the inheritance was tangible, like setting down a long-carried weight. His head felt clearer. Knowledge that had been forced into him now truly belonged to him. He could examine it, extend it, and build upon it. He suspected his father had received an inheritance too. As head of the House of Black, Orion knew most family secrets. What it was exactly, if it existed at all, Orion hadn't told him, and Regulus hadn't asked. He would find out in time. Late one January night, back in the Room of Requirement, Regulus sat cross-legged and closed his eyes. He called up star orbit meditation and unfolded the star chart in his mind. The 3 stars of the belt, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, glowed steadily and formed the constellation's backbone. Betelgeuse burned in the upper left of the chart, its red light fluctuating and flickering, symbolizing change and imminent explosion. The 4-star system ran smoothly. Magical energy circulated along the imagined stellar trajectories. With each cycle, his body felt subtly refined, his spirit steadied, and his overall magical capacity rose by an almost imperceptible fraction. Now he attempted, for the second time, to light the 5th star, the left shoulder star, a blue-white light representing the warrior, guardianship, and boundaries. He concentrated and constructed a model of its position, brightness, and orbit in relation to the other 4 stars. The model took shape, but the star still would not light. With the second failure, the reason became clearer. He had the magical energy and the spirit, but they weren't aligned with the star's symbolism. That left shoulder star required a will to protect, the conviction to hold a place for someone or something, even when the cost outweighed the gain. Regulus examined himself. What did he want to protect? His answer came instantly. Himself, his magical career, the family's assets. Those were interests, not convictions. Protecting interests is a calculation. One acts while the cost of losing them is greater than the cost of defense. The kind of protection this star demanded was different, a steadfast choice to stand one's ground regardless of cost. He didn't have that yet. He remembered how he had lit Betelgeuse. At the time, he had been raw with irritation and aggression, Bella's letter, the residue of the battle, and that unstable, explosive state had resonated with Betelgeuse's symbolism. Later, after summoning a Patronus and feeling the power of soul, and under Professor Flitwick's guidance accepting the irrational side of magic, he'd begun to doubt his approach. Lighting a star was not simply building a model and pumping energy into it. It was finding the point of resonance between one's inner state and the star's meaning. Understanding that, he stopped forcing the model. He let his mind open to the whole chart, the steady stability of the belt, the volatile force of Betelgeuse, and the empty left shoulder that should be the constellation's shield. He tried to feel what that missing star ought to be. Not a specific vow, but an abstract posture, an intention to stand here, like the walls of a fortress, like a nation's boundary markers, like the presence of the sky itself, never the first to strike, but such that any intrusion would meet an invisible barrier. As he deepened that image, something inside him stirred, and the imagery resonated with a part of his heart. Chapter 85, 4.5 stars. Regulus wanted to keep his path of study undisturbed and his family's assets safe from looters. He wanted to protect the clear, rational view of the world he'd held since transmigrating, to keep it free of fanaticism and ignorance. He wanted to preserve the purity in his heart. This was not romantic sentimentality or soul power. It was practical reason. He had to protect his space for survival and growth. A resonance followed. In his mind, the position of Bellatrix flared with a faint light. Unlike the other 4 stars, which shone fully, this was a preparatory glow, like embers newly kindled that still needed more fuel. For now, though, it was all he could manage. He grasped that state and connected the established 4-star system to Bellatrix's tentative light. The original 4-star system had been an internal cycle of a stable foundation and explosive change. With Bellatrix added, it became a framework of stability, rupture, and defense. Bellatrix did not add extra magical energy. It reinforced the structure, making the entire system steadier and more resistant to external shocks. When Bellatrix linked in, Regulus felt his inner magical energy vibrate. The total quantity hadn't increased, but its quality had. Control precision improved and the energy felt steadier. He opened his eyes, raised his wand, and, riding the vibration of his magic and the system update, tried to skip deep meditation and invoke Betelgeuse's explosive image directly. Reducto. The spell shot out and struck the stone wall opposite. No grand detonation occurred. Instead, spiderweb cracks raced across the surface, and the whole section quietly collapsed into fist-sized stones that clattered to the floor. The force was about 3 times that of a standard reductor curse, yet the magical energy cost had only gone up by 50%. Compared with before, consumption decreased while power rose. Progress. But Regulus felt suddenly drained. Mental exhaustion hit him. Calling the explosive image of Betelgeuse without deep meditation demanded intense focus and will, and it burned through his mental reserves. That one strike had taken roughly 10% of his mental strength. He couldn't use it often, at least not yet. He would need time to recover after each use, or it would impair subsequent casting and thought. He regulated his breathing and let himself recover, reflecting on the advance. The star orbit meditation had become his own. The method he had once learned from the book Astral Meditation retained only its skeleton. Everything else had been replaced and improved. The 4-star system, plus the tentative 5th star, was unique and matched his philosophy of magical energy and his inner state. He became even more certain that cultivating magic wasn't merely accumulating knowledge and technique. It was about resonance between heart and world. Rational calculation set the direction. Emotional resonance supplied the power. Only together could one go further. He put his wand away and left the room of requirement. The corridors were silent. The castle slept. He returned to the Slytherin dormitory. Avery and Alex were already asleep. Hermes's bed was empty. He washed, lay down, and closed his eyes. The star orbit meditation ran automatically. The 4 stars turned slowly in the depths of his consciousness, and Bellatrix's position held a faint light, waiting for the day it would flare fully. In the first week of February, a certain mood spread through Hogwarts. The next weekend was Hogsmeade. 3rd years and above were allowed to visit. The older students planned for butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks, middlers argued about the newest sweets at Honeyduke's, and the younger ones listened with faces full of envy and expectation. After charms, Lucretius Boak stopped Regulus at the corner of a corridor. "Hogsmeade weekends next week," Lucretius said, his fingers tracing the edge of his house badge. His voice was low. "Our shop's got a new shipment of interesting things. I told you to come see. This is the perfect opportunity." Regulus looked up, gray eyes steady. It had been only a month since he'd accepted Lucretius's invitation in the Slytherin common room and said he would go during the holidays. Now, with term only a few weeks old, Lucretius brought it up again, more direct, more urgent. Had something happened that Regulus wasn't aware of? "Mr. Borgin is very much looking forward to it," Lucretius added. Regulus nodded. He knew the reference to Old Borgin well enough. "I'll need a parental consent form." "Of course." Lucretius's mouth curved into a practiced smile. "Procedure must be followed. I'll wait at the Hogsmeade entrance." He left as decisively as he'd come. Regulus thought to himself, "If I refused for being too young, what would you do?" Back in the dormitory, Regulus sat at his desk and spread clean parchment out. He dipped his quill, hesitated, then wrote, "Father, Lucretius Boak has invited me again to visit Borgin and Burke's during Hogsmeade weekend next week. It has only been a month since the last invitation, and I need a parental consent form to apply to Professor Slughorn for leave. Also, the Borgin family's attitude seems different. Has something happened recently? Please inform me. Regulus." He sealed the letter with the Black family crest and sent it by owl. At breakfast the next morning, a family owl landed beside him and dropped a thick reply with gilt edges. Orion's handwriting was steady and controlled. "Regulus, consent form attached. I will notify Professor Slughorn separately." Regarding Borgin, 2 weeks ago, the Ministry set up a special review office for dark arts objects under Barty Crouch. The review covers registered transactions in dark arts objects, especially props and high lethality curse items. Borgin and Burke's deals in those goods, so they are first in the line of fire. The review hasn't expanded into Nocturne Alley yet, but pressure has already been transmitted. Borgin is establishing contact through you to seek a buffer or early warning at the Wisengamot level. This is a business negotiation, not a favor. Go to signal the Black family's willingness to make contact. The terms will be negotiated directly between me and Old Borgin. Note, Nocturne Alley has been restless. Holders of sensitive items are eager to offload them, and conflicts are frequent. When you go, enter the shop only. Don't linger in the alley. Regulus folded the letter into his inner pocket. The Ministry's sudden action, Barty Crouch leading the review, meant something significant. Crouch was known for toughness and efficiency. He could be acting under pressure from higher-ups, or because dark arts traffic was increasing with Voldemort's forces expanding, or because Dumbledore's faction had pushed restrictions through the Wisengamot. It was also possible Crouch wanted to build political capital for future ambitions. Regulus had a general sense of the Ministry's politics. Factions, bargaining, laws that looked majestic in print but behaved flexibly in practice. Pureblood families had long been embedded in the Ministry. Normally such reviews would be announced in advance. That this one hadn't was unusual. Either Crouch had bypassed normal channels, or the decision came from a level beyond the reach of pureblood influence. Either way, the situation was shifting. After breakfast, he left the Great Hall and, after afternoon classes, went to see Professor Slughorn. At 4, he knocked on the potions office door. "Come in," Slughorn's voice called, all cheer. The office smelled of rare potion ingredients. Photos of famous wizards lined the walls, Silverware gleamed on the desk, shelves held exotic components, and near the fireplace, a small round table bore half a bottle of mead and plates of snacks. Professor Slughorn sat in a large armchair, a thick ledger in hand, and his face lit up when he saw Regulus. Regulus! He set the ledger down and waved. What a rare guest! First voluntary visit this term, is it? Regulus inclined his head. Professor. Sit, sit. Slughorn grinned and the chair opposite slid out. Just received a letter from your father. He set the parchment down with a knowing smile. I know about Hogsmeade weekend. The application form is here and it's signed. He pushed the form across the desk. Procedure's in order. I'll handle it. Go ahead. Regulus thanked him politely, said goodbye, and left. The few days before Hogsmeade passed quietly. Regulus kept to his schedule. Classes, practice of 37 Tuafcom in the room of requirement, and long hours in the library and the restricted section. The error in his spatial warp had shrunk to 30 centimeters. He still kept the same number of space anchor charms, but they lasted longer. The fifth star of star orbit meditation remained in a preparatory state, though the four-star system itself functioned more smoothly. A faint glimmer at the position of 24 was still weak, but it persisted, like a distant lighthouse. Out of reach for now, but enough to point a way forward. The will to protect. He had not yet found exactly what he must protect, but he was certain of what he could not afford to lose. On Friday night, he received a second letter from Orion. Regulus, I have had preliminary communication with Old Borgin. The Ministry's review is focused on large-scale cursed items and highly lethal dark arts props. House of Borgin has several sensitive things in stock that need to be dealt with before the review expands. When you go to see them, Old Borgin may show you one or two items to test whether the Black family is interested in taking them over or providing a storage channel. Remember, only look. Don't touch, don't promise anything. Specific terms will be discussed when I speak to House of Borgin. Also, there have been 3 recent conflicts involving dark wizards in Nocturne Alley, all over stolen items. The Auror office has increased patrols, but the effect is limited. Be vigilant. Large-scale cursed objects and highly lethal dark artifacts, whatever their exact nature, the Ministry strictly prohibited them. House of Borgin was trying to move a few risky items and hoped the Black family might act as a middleman or custodian. How to handle that would be decided by Father. Regulus' job was only to look and send a signal. He lay back on his bed and closed his eyes. Star orbit meditation ran almost automatically. The 4 stars turned steadily within his consciousness. The faint light at 24 remained small but steady, a guide even when distant. The second Saturday of February dawned cold and gray. By 7 o'clock, the great hall was noisier than usual. Third years and up clustered at the long tables, talking itineraries, exchanging galleons, signing permission forms. First and second years sat watching them with wide eyes and longing faces. After breakfast, Regulus rose and made for the castle gates. The corridors were crowded. Peeves drifted overhead, grabbed a handful of chalk and hurled it into the stream of students, only to be dragged back by Filch. A few Gryffindors ran past him and nearly collided with Regulus. Some apologized when they recognized him. Others tried to provoke, but friends pulled them away. Outside, a cold wind hit him. The sky was leaden, low clouds promising snow. The ground had a thin frost that cracked crisply underfoot. The path to Hogsmeade was already marked by footprints cutting across the white, and Regulus followed it. Students passed in both directions, their laughter and chatter bright in the sharp air. When Hogsmeade came into view, Lucretius Boak stood under the stone arch at the village entrance. He wasn't in school robes. He wore a dark green travel cloak with the House of Borgin crest pinned at his collar, crossed 38 38s and keys over an open book. A few Ravenclaw girls glanced, whispered, and hurried on. A Hufflepuff 7th year nodded. Lucretius nodded back. "Good morning, Regulus," he said. "Morning, Lucretius." They fell into step and walked down the main street. On either side were crooked, gabled cottages dusted with snow, chimneys sending up white smoke. Shop signs swung in the wind. Honeyduke's windows were piled with jars of candy. The smell of butterbeer and warm pastry drifted from the 3 broomsticks. Laughter and popping noises came from Zonko's. Lucretius slowed and pointed things out as if on a tour. Honeyduke's, founded in 1935. Ambrosius Flume began with a blood-flavored lollipop and built it into a nationwide line. They even have a secret tasting room in the cellar for regulars. The Three Broomsticks, landlady Madame Rosmerta. Her husband died 10 years ago and she runs the place. If you want ministry rumors, buy a butterbeer and an ear. Dervish and Bangas sells tools, sneakoscopes, remembralls, spectre specs. Not the finest quality, but acceptable for presents. He spoke evenly, listing histories, proprietors, and practical functions like a guide. Regulus listened with eyes taking in the street. Hogsmeade was the only all-wizard village in Britain, a medieval refuge that had grown into a commercial and social hub. It preserved old wizard architecture and marketplace customs, and under its quaint facades lay tangled networks of influence. Each shop belonged to a family, and each family had its obligations and connections. The Flumes with the Department of Magical Food Inspection, Madame Rosmerta's ties to an editor at the Daily Prophet, the Banges family's seat on the Hogwarts Board of Governors. Lucretius led him into a side alley and stopped before a gray stone house. No sign, boarded windows, a heavy oak door with a bronze snake knocker. House of Borgen's property in Hogsmeade, he said, producing a key. Some transactions aren't fit for public places. Inside was a plain parlor, a cold hearth, dusty furniture, the stale smell of long vacancy. A faded map of Hogsmeade hung on the wall. Lucretius reached into his cloak, took a tin, and lifted the lid. A handful of bright green powder sparkled, flue powder. He tossed it into the hearth. The flames flared emerald, and a voice roared, 13B Nocturne Alley, Borgen and Berks. Lucretius stepped into the flames and vanished. Regulus followed. The flue ride was a cascade of colors and sounds, smoother than apparition, which tore through space. The flue slid along set channels. Regulus thought over the difference. The space anchor charm could disrupt a single flue node, but could not undo the whole network unless anchors hit many core nodes at once. Nodes were too numerous, and the magical flow too changeable for a single charm to do more than a local interference. 3 seconds later, he fell out of another fireplace, steadying himself and brushing dust from his cloak. He found himself in a low, dim room. Cobwebbed beams, dark bricks stained with damp. The air smelled of dust and old parchment, with a cloying note of sweet, greasy preservative. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling, crammed with oddities, shrunken heads, rusty shackles, eyeballs in jars, black-bound books that turned their own pages. Behind the counter, a thin, tall wizard looked up, very old, with scant hair, pale skin, and deep-set eyes that took him in sharply. He wore black robes, his fingers were long and neat, and an obsidian ring gleamed on the index finger of his right hand. Caractacus Borgen, the wizard rasped. Call me Mr. Borgen. Old Borgen. Regulus Black, Regulus replied, stepping forward. Old Borgen studied him for a beat, then the corners of his mouth lifted into something like a smile. Orion's son, he said. Your father came here when he was young, too. That was 20 years ago. He stepped out from behind the counter, his footsteps almost soundless. Borgen and Berks, he went on, tracing the worn edge of the counter with a finger. Founded 1832, a joint venture between the Borgen family and the Burke family. We deal in acquisition, appraisal, and sale of dark arts items. Of the 13 similar shops in Nocturne Alley, we are number 1. Regulus's eyes flicked. He had assumed the shop's name was simply its owner's. He hadn't expected it to be a family enterprise. Caractacus represented the Borgen family. Where the Burkes were, he did not know, perhaps withdrawn or quietly partners. Follow me, old Borgen said, moving toward the back of the shop. Some things are kept in the warehouse. Lucretius stood by the counter and did not follow. Old Borgen hadn't called him. Regulus passed through a doorway hung with black curtains into a narrow corridor lined with shelves of glass jars. Organs floated in preservation fluids. Hearts beating slowly, brains washed in a faint green glow, lungs rhythmically contracting. At the end of the corridor, a heavy iron door stood closed. Old Borgen muttered a spell. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. The warehouse was twice the size of the shop, with a higher ceiling and rows of neatly arranged shelves. Things were sorted by category: cursed items in one section, dark arts artifacts in another, experimental records separately shelved, and a locked area for dangerous biological products. Chapter 87, Bojin Bouquet Store. Every item had a label noting its name, origin, danger level, and handling recommendations. Regulus scanned the nearest shelf. Label, Weeping Madonna statue. Origin, Paris, France, abandoned church, suspected dark wizard experiment on muggles. Danger level, 3 stars. Those who make contact fall into unstoppable sorrow, eventually suffering a mental breakdown. Handling recommendation, seal in a lead-lined, rune-inscribed container. Avoid direct eye contact. Label, Vengeance Dagger. Origin, Scottish Highlands, ancestral heirloom of a certain family. Danger level, 2 stars. The person stabbed will endure all the pain the victim has ever suffered. Handling recommendation, seal in a longhorn ivory sheath, must not be unsheathed. Label, Memory Weaver. Origin, unknown, suspected ancient alchemical product. Danger level, 4 stars, can weave false memories into a living brain. Handling recommendation, theoretical research only, practical application prohibited. Old Borgin walked to a display stand in the center of the warehouse, covered with black velvet. I'll show you 3 items today, he grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. All acquired recently, and the Ministry of Magic is looking for them. He lifted the velvet to reveal 3 objects. The first was a palm-sized bronze box, its surface carved with twisted runes, a dark red sheen seeping from the gaps. The box had no keyhole and no seams, but Regulus could feel something moving inside, subtle, yet unmistakable. A cursed box. Old Borgin's finger hovered above it without touching. It seals a family blood curse. In the 14th century, 2 pure-blood families were sworn enemies. One side created this to curse the other's line to extinction. Both families later perished together. The box was lost, the way to open it lost, but the curse remained. Anyone who attempts to open it will see their direct descendants die unnatural deaths, generation after generation, within 3 generations. He looked at Regulus. One of the Ministry's criteria for defining a large-scale cursed item is that it affects more than 10 people or lasts over a century. This box meets both. Regulus didn't meet his eyes. He stared at the runes. They were a variant of ancient runes. He could make out a few words: bloodline, binding, transmission. The curse likely used the caster's life and soul as fuel, binding itself to the target family's blood. As long as the bloodline continued, the curse would persist. Breaking it would require destroying the original caster's remains, overwriting it with a more powerful curse, or severing the cursed bloodline entirely. "Is anyone interested?" he asked calmly, as if discussing ordinary merchandise. 3 buyers, Old Borgin replied. One wants to use it against an opponent, one wants to study an ancient curse, and one is a collector. They're all waiting to see how the Ministry's inquiries go. He lifted another corner of the velvet. The second item was a crystal skull, human-sized, with 2 rubies set in the eye sockets, light and shadow churning inside the gems. Tiny fissures ran over the surface, a ghostly blue light leaking from them. "A soul container," Old Borgin said with a meaningful smile. "Not the high-end ones, just a crude version. It can seal a portion of a dying person's soul, maintaining a fragment of consciousness so they can still converse with the living. It has many drawbacks. The seal dissipates over time, the vessel is fragile, and the soul inside endures constant pain, perpetually sensing its own decay." He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, as if savoring an old scent. Regulus widened his perception. The skull emitted weak soul fluctuations, chaotic, fragmented, full of desperate shrieks. There was a consciousness within, but it was shattered, barely held together, and liable to collapse at any moment. "Origin?" he asked. "An Egyptian tomb, or rather, a pyramid over 1,000 years old," Old Borgin answered. "Grave robbers dug it up, and it passed through 3 hands before it reached me. I don't know who is sealed inside. Could be a pharaoh, a priest, or just an unlucky slave buried with them." Lowering his voice, he added, "The Ministry has been investigating items involving soul containment recently. After last year's Azkaban breakout, they suspect certain Death Eaters are using similar methods to cheat death. If this skull is discovered, it could be enough to put me in the dock at the Wizengamot." Regulus nodded. Such things needed strict control. Souls and time were the province of the unspeakables at the Ministry and were not meant to circulate. Old Borgin lifted the last piece of velvet. The third item was a cane with an ebony shaft nearly 1.5 meters long, topped with a black pearl the size of a fist. Silver filigree ran across the pearl, shimmering faintly. The cane lay still on the velvet with no obvious magical signature, looking like a finely made craft. This one has no name, Old Borgin said. The fellow who brought it said it was found deep in a ruin in northern Europe. I've tested it. The shaft is dragon heartwood, at least 3,000 years old. The black pearl came from a deep-sea giant octopus. Those creatures live for over 500 years. The silverwork is metal refined from meteorites, an old smelting method that's been lost. He picked up the cane with extreme care. Its function is unknown. It doesn't react to standard magical detection. Other detection spells yield nothing, and even dark arts wards mark it harmless. But every researcher who has touched it has the same dream within 3 days. Old Borgin laid the cane back on the velvet, his movements steady. No one knows what it really is, he said softly, clearly enjoying the suspense. But the 7 researchers who touched it all went mad in the end. Regulus stared at the cane. Specific symptoms? They began babbling as if they'd woken from a nightmare, Old Borgin replied, screaming about collapse and destruction, insisting everyone must die, as if they'd been forcibly given some hopeless revelation. People thought they were insane, and perhaps they were. He turned to Regulus, eyes wide, his voice taking on a chilling tone as if telling a tale to frighten a child. They all died. When they died, each of them used their own wands to cast the killing curse on themselves, every single one. The room fell silent for a few seconds before Regulus said, "The killing curse requires a strong intent to kill. Casting it on oneself means they truly believed, down to their core, that they had to die." Old Borgin shrugged, bored with the lack of drama. Or something made them believe death was the only release. He added, almost philosophically, other spells can sometimes be undone, but the killing curse means death once it strikes. In a grim way, it was the most straightforward end, no prolonged suffering. Regulus's gaze lingered on the black pearl, the silver filigree catching the dim light. Cognitive tampering, mimetic contamination, consciousness infusion? Such concepts reminded him of things that shouldn't exist in ordinary magical theory. Still, that line of thought confused him. The systems weren't supposed to overlap like that. He couldn't figure it out with his current knowledge, so he set it aside. He did have one advantage beyond standard scholarship, a small personal artifact he kept close. He raised his right hand and rubbed his chest. It felt faintly warm. Then he noticed Old Borgin himself seemed unaffected. "You've touched it," he said, staring. Old Borgin admitted. "I dreamed twice, but I didn't go mad." "Why?" "Maybe I'm old and my brain is set in its ways. New things don't take. Or maybe I've seen too much madness and this level of it doesn't register. Most likely, though, I didn't try to understand it. Those who went mad were desperate to study it, analyze the principles, find a pattern, escape the predicament. I didn't. I only recorded what happened and decided to sell it." He spread his hands, smiling in a way that suggested many things. Some things are safer not to understand than to comprehend. He covered the velvet, hiding the 3 items once more. "These 3 are hot potatoes," Old Borgin said. "The cursed box involves blood curses, the skull involves soul containment, and the cane is unknown, but dangerous. If the Ministry finds any one of them, it'll bring endless trouble to the House of Borgin." "So you want to offload them," Regulus said flatly. "Find a safe place to store them, or a suitable buyer." Old Borgin fixed him with a steady look. The Black family has history, depth, and roots strong enough to absorb these things. More importantly, Orion sits on the Wizengamot and can provide political buffering. Regulus was silent for a few seconds. "I only came to take a look," he said. "Of course." Old Borgin nodded. "The decision rests with your father, but you have seen them and know their value and risk. Go back and tell Orion that the House of Borgin is willing to trade these 3 items in exchange for the Black family's key support in the Wizengamot for the next 3 years." "And what specific support?" Regulus asked. "When the Ministry of Magic holds a legislative vote, cast the vote we need. When the investigation expands, give us advance notice. When necessary, say a few favorable words at the hearing." Old Borgin spoke calmly. "A fair trade. We provide the physical objects, you provide the political support." Regulus did not answer at once. He weighed it in his head. The 3 items were undeniably valuable. The cursed box could teach much about ancient blood curses. The skull might reveal secrets of soul magic, and though he couldn't say what could be learned from the cane, his instincts told him it would be useful. But the risk was serious too, especially the scrutiny from the ministry. Did the Black family need to take that risk? It depended on his father's read of the situation, on how highly the family valued House of Borgin, and on how deep a partnership they expected. "I'll pass the message along," Regulus said, his tone solemn. Old Borgin turned toward the door. "Time to go. Lucretius will see you off." They left the warehouse and returned to the shop's front hall. Lucretius was still standing by the counter. At their appearance, his posture loosened a little. Old Borgin said nothing more, simply waving them on. Lucretius led Regulus to the fireplace and scooped up a handful of flue powder. "Hogsmeade, Borgin residence," he said. The flames flashed green, and they stepped through one after the other. Once back in the gray stone house in Hogsmeade, Lucretius visibly relaxed. He lingered by the hearth a few seconds as if collecting himself, then turned to Regulus. "How was it?" "Very eye-opening," Regulus answered briefly. A twitch at the corner of Lucretius's mouth suggested he wanted to smile but couldn't. "I was 12 the first time I went," he said, lowering his voice with a hint of emotion. "Father took me there to learn the trade. That day, the shop happened to be taking delivery of special cargo. The things I saw gave me nightmares for months." He stared out the window. Laughter from students drifted in from Hogsmeade's main street, and the distant smell of Honeyduke's sweets mixed oddly with the dust in the room. "House of Borgin has traded like this for 5 generations, Lucretius said, his voice low, almost to himself. "Since my great-grandfather, we've trafficked in dark objects in Nocturne Alley. We've seen the worst, met the most dangerous people, and grown used to surviving in the cracks between light and shadow." He turned back to Regulus. "That doesn't mean we like the darkness. It's simply the path the family chose. We were born into it, and all we can do is keep walking." Regulus listened. He felt the complexity in Lucretius's tone: pride, resignation, the burden of duty, and a weary acceptance. Being the heir to a house was not only honor, it was responsibility and a shackle, a life laid out before you from birth. Sirius had run away, refusing that chain. Lucretius Boak would one day take over the family business and keep that shop in Nocturne Alley running. He would keep company with darkness. He had accepted it, even if he did not relish it. "Let's go," Lucretius said, drawing a breath and regaining his usual composure. "Time to go back to school." They stepped out onto Hogsmeade's main street. At 3 in the afternoon, the village was crowded. A queue at the 3 broomsticks, Honeydukes packed, and a cluster of Hufflepuffs examining a new sneakoscope in the window at Dervish and Bangis. Lucretius steered Regulus toward the edge of town. They nodded to acquaintances as they passed without stopping. Near Zonko's joke shop, Regulus felt a faint spatial ripple behind him, the distinct precursor to apparition. Someone was about to materialize very close, less than 10 meters away. In Hogsmeade, that was not unusual. No muggles, and students often apparated between shops, but Regulus reacted anyway. He didn't break stride. He quietly mobilized the magical power within him. An invisible barrier unfolded, clinging to his skin, thin as a cicada wing, yet surprisingly tough. His left fingers flexed beneath his cloak. A faint crimson glow gathered at his fingertips. His right hand slipped into his sleeve to grip his wand, the tip pointed toward the ground, ready to be raised. A harsh cracking sound split the air. A figure blinked into existence, staggered 2 paces, then steadied. It was a middle-aged wizard in tattered robes, his face streaked with blood, a broken wand clutched in his right hand. He scanned the street, and when he saw Regulus and Lucretius, his expression hardened. He lunged, not to attack, but to hide, ducking behind the 2 of them and reaching out with his left hand toward Regulus's shoulder. Regulus tilted his body a fraction of an inch, the hand closed on air. He prepared to counter when another apparition shimmered nearby. The newcomer was a young female auror with short blonde hair, wand already raised and trained on the hiding man. "Finn, give up the resistance," she barked. "You can't escape." The man Finn was panting, fingers white around the broken wand. "Let me go," he rasped, "or I'll kill these 2 children." A rough voice answered. Alastair Moody stared at Finn, then at Lucretius, then back to Finn. "Go ahead and try," Moody said, voice like gravel. "Your wand's broken." The situation was a tense standoff. Regulus froze, his mind racing. Finn was a dark wizard, fleeing the Aurors, looking for hostages. Moody and the female Auror were on the hunt. Regulus and Lucretius had been caught in the middle. Finn's plan, taking students as bargaining chips, made little sense in Hogsmeade, where many students and prefects were around. Ordinary dark wizards avoided this place. He had blundered right into a patrol, and he had chosen the wrong targets. Regulus was unnervingly calm. He had no intention of panicking. He was confident he could evade or even fight back. Finn, focused entirely on the Aurors, clearly did not consider them a serious threat. What harm could a couple of students pose? Lucretius' expression remained calm, his right hand already touching his wand. Regulus glanced at him, asking silently if they should act. Regulus shook his head slightly. Moody and the Auror were present. Finn couldn't get away. Besides, it was interesting to watch. Sweat beaded on Finn's brow. He let the broken wand hover indecisively between Regulus and Lucretius, as if choosing which to take. "Back off," he snarled at Moody. "Let me use the flu powder to leave." Or he never finished. Moody made one small motion with his wand, and a thin silver beam flashed down to the ground at Finn's feet. The cobbles softened beneath him like swampland. Finn's ankles sank, throwing his balance. His broken wand pointed away. Simultaneously, the young Auror fired a stupefy, a red bolt that slammed into Finn's chest. Finn cursed and tried to apparate, but his wand was broken and his magic faltered. He managed only to deflect half the stunning spell. The rest struck his shoulder. His body went rigid, his eyes rolled, and he crumpled backward as the ground beneath him hardened again. The whole thing took no more than 2 seconds. Moody walked up and checked Finn with his wand. Confirming he was unconscious, he turned to Regulus and Lucretius and demanded brusquely, "Names." "Regulus Black," Regulus said. "Lucretius Boak," Lucretius answered. Moody repeated the names, his tone inscrutable. "Black." He then looked at Lucretius with blunt curiosity. "House of Borgin, from that shop in Nocturne Alley?" "Yes," Lucretius said evenly. Moody nodded once and addressed the young Auror. "Take him back and notify the ministry. Finn's been caught. Some of the involved items were recovered." She acknowledged him, floated Finn with a levitation charm, grabbed a fistful of flu powder, and begged, apparated away. A crowd of students had gathered on the street, whispering and pointing. Several prefects pushed through to see what had happened. Moody turned to Regulus. "You didn't move. Why didn't you dodge or fight back?" "He was behind me," Regulus replied, meeting Moody's gaze calmly. "I couldn't see him. Besides, the Aurors were there. I trusted the professionals to handle it." Moody studied him as if committing his face to memory. He did not look convinced. A boy that calm in such a moment was unusual. After a long look, he simply turned and walked away. The patrolling Aurors arrived, dispersing the crowd and asking what had happened. Lucretius stepped forward as a prefect to explain, with Regulus adding a few details from the side. The matter was quickly resolved. Finn was a black market dealer who had stolen a magical artifact from a certain Borgin family. After being pursued by Aurors for 3 days, he had been caught in Hogsmeade that afternoon. After confirming that the 2 boys were unharmed, the Aurors left, telling the younger students that the Hogsmeade weekend was over early and they were to return straight to school without loitering. The younger students howled in collective disappointment but had no choice. On the walk back to Hogwarts, Lucretius was quiet for a long while. Only as they neared the castle gates did he speak. "Moody, Alastair Moody, an elite Auror. Many dark wizards fear him, and they hate him too." "I know," Regulus said. "The way he looked at me just now." Lucretius hesitated, then continued. "It was like he was trying to judge whether I was Finn's accomplice." "You aren't," Regulus cut in. "He suspects I am." Lucretius's voice was flat. The surname Borgin carries a special mark with the Aurors, especially with hardliners like Moody. Regulus said nothing. He already knew that in the years to come, Moody would be one of the staunchest fighters against Voldemort, that he would make terrible sacrifices, and that his identity would later be used in other ways. But in 1973, Moody was simply an active Auror, famed for his vigilance and paranoia. The House of Borgin traded in dark artifacts. Naturally, they were high on the Auror's list. Today's incident might have been a coincidence, but it was enough for Moody to remember Lucretius's face. "Be careful," Regulus advised. "The Auror office is only going to grow in power." Lucretius nodded, his expression settling back into the composed mask of a Borgin heir. They entered the castle and split up in the entrance hall. Regulus made his way to the Slytherin common room, replaying the day in his head, the three items from Borgin and Burke's, the pressure of the ministry inspections, old Borgin's trade proposal, and finally, the accidental hostage situation. Each incident underlined the truth he already felt, that beneath the wizarding world's placid surface there were rising currents of trouble. The owlery's wooden racks creaked as a cold wind drove fine snow through the gaps and nipped at his face. Regulus drew a strip of parchment from his inner pocket, rolled it, slipped it into a small copper tube, and entrusted it to a gray-feathered owl. The castle's silhouette was hazy in the distance, and the low murmur of students echoed through the corridors. Young witches and wizards always seemed to brim with energy. Inside the Slytherin common room, warm air drove the chill away. The fire burned bright. Several second years were clustered around a chessboard, frowning and arguing over a move. Regulus sank into an armchair and idly traced the carvings on the armrest, his thoughts drifting back to Borgin and Burke's. The House of Borgin had traded in dark artifacts for 5 generations. This was no idle boast. The connections between pure-blood families were never mere social niceties, they were a tangled web of mutual interests. Regulus understood that a family like Borgin must have secret distribution channels. Maybe they used Gringotts' underground networks to ship risky items overseas. Maybe they entrusted sensitive goods temporarily to other families' businesses. Perhaps they even had informants inside the ministry who could warn them of impending inspections. To claim they lacked the means to handle dangerous artifacts would be absurd. Yet they had extended an olive branch to the Blacks, and Regulus suspected they were testing the waters. The ministry inspections had come suddenly, and Barty Crouch's hard line had put Borgin under real pressure. They needed an ally with political weight. The Black family's seats on the Wizengamot, Orion's connections, and their industrial reach were the safety net Borgin wanted. For the Blacks, the benefit was obvious too. Borgin controlled the largest distribution channel for dark objects in Nocturne Alley, offering access to rare magical knowledge and special implements, things invaluable to Regulus's studies. The materials already in his possession were enough to keep him busy for a long time, but an alliance could widen his access. There were serious downsides. Borgin's trade existed in a gray area. Being closely tied to them would invite greater ministry scrutiny and might even attract suspicion from Voldemort's followers. The Dark Lord would certainly be attuned to the flow of dark artifacts. The Black family's sudden involvement in that market might not sit well with him. Voldemort's ties with Borgin were already ambiguous. Regulus's thoughts turned to Lucretius. The younger boy had been different today, more genuine, with a certain depth. As a Slytherin prefect, Lucretius might not be the most powerful young wizard at Hogwarts, but he was among the most capable overall. His academic record was excellent, and he managed school affairs with the right balance. Never heavy-handed enough to breed resentment, never weak enough to forfeit authority. In Borgin circles, he could preserve the family's dignity while maintaining amicable relations with heirs of other houses. Snape's warning from a week earlier still echoed in Regulus's mind. The older Slytherins had been meeting privately, their rhetoric growing more radical and obsessed with blood purity. As a prefect, Lucretius could hardly be ignorant of that. Regulus suspected he was likely involved. The status of prefect gave Lucretius access to core information, and yet he hadn't shared a single hint with Regulus. That silence told Regulus something important. Lucretius knew his limits. Had he spoken, Regulus might have been forced to choose, intervene and reveal his own stance too soon, suppress the extremists and alienate them, or permit them and appear indifferent. Because Lucretius stayed silent, Regulus could feign ignorance and keep focusing on his own path, avoiding a conflict that didn't yet concern him. His attention returned to Borgin and Burke's. What little foresight he had was just fragments. The magical world's complexity outstripped his vague impressions. For example, he had once assumed Borgin and Burke's was run by a single family, only to learn today that it was a partnership between the Borgin and Boke families. The gap in his knowledge reminded him that every step required caution. He could not act on half-remembered facts. A spark popped from the fireplace and sizzled out on the flagstones. As more students returned from Hogsmeade, the common room grew busier. Most were still flushed with excitement, clustering to trade stories. Regulus left the common room, and the corridor noise sharpened. A few Gryffindors were huddled together, breathlessly recounting the Hogsmeade kidnapping. Words like dark wizard, auror, broken wand, and unlucky fellow floated past. The great hall blazed with light. The long tables were piled with food, the smell of roast chicken blended with the sweet scent of treacle tart and the yeasty tang of fresh bread. Avery and Alex were already seated at the Slytherin table. When Regulus walked in, Avery waved and, in his eagerness, knocked over a small salt shaker, which he caught with a flustered grin. "You're finally here." Avery leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice pitched higher than quite necessary and his eyes bright. He peppered Regulus with questions, mostly from curiosity. "Is that Hogsmeade thing true? Were you taken hostage by a dark wizard? Boke too?" Then Avery launched into outraged declarations. "This is an assault on the purebloods. To move against us in Hogsmeade, the Ministry must punish them, throw them in Azkaban, and never let them see sunlight again. My father says you can't be soft on scum who break the rules, or they'll only get bolder." Alex was more restrained. "You're not hurt, are you? I heard it was chaotic. The Aurors got involved, and that dark wizard looked dangerous." Unease flashed behind his eyes. "Things are getting tense. I used to only read about dark wizards in the paper. I never thought we'd run into one. My mother wrote to tell me to be careful. She says it's not safe out there." Regulus sat, picked up his knife and fork, and cut a piece of chicken with steady movements. "I'm fine. The Aurors reached us quickly, so no real harm was done. The dark wizard's wand was broken, so he wasn't much of a threat." He left it at that. To Regulus, the episode was merely an interesting little interlude. Disruptive, perhaps, but not worth turning into a drama. Chapter 90. What are you two hiding from me? Avery pressed for details about the scene. What did that dark wizard look like? Was his face twisted with malice? To dare take a hostage with a broken wand, he must be mad. If it were me, I'd have disarmed him straight away with Expelliarmus, then followed up with a binding curse so he'd be flat on his face and unable to move. He grew excited as he spoke, his hands mimicking the motion of waving a wand, his wrists snapping as if casting. Scum like that need to be taught a lesson. The dignity of our family name can't be allowed to be tarnished. Alex frowned and replied in a low voice. "It's wiser to avoid danger. If you really ran into that sort of thing, you'd put your own safety first. Dark wizards can do anything. There's no need to go head-to-head with them." As he spoke, he unconsciously edged closer to Regulus, his body leaning forward. "I've heard some dark wizards set traps with the dark arts. Even if you manage to subdue them, you could still get hit. It's not worth the risk. Safety's important, of course, but you can't be a coward." Avery slammed his hand on the table, earning a few sidelong looks from the other students. He deliberately raised his voice. "If you don't even have that much courage, how will you ever make your name in the wizarding world? Heirs of noble houses shouldn't let people think we're easy targets. Of course, if you're truly outmatched, you run. Only a fool fights a losing battle." He was the first to laugh then, a youthful, roguish spark in his eyes. Regulus didn't join the argument. He ate his dinner quietly. The roast chicken on his plate was crisp on the outside and tender inside, dipped in a little gravy. Just right. More and more eyes drifted his way, some curious, some envious, some admiring. To young Slytherins, the idea that a dark wizard had taken a hostage right in Hogsmeade was thrilling. It would be the talk of the school for days. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement from the Hufflepuff table. Eleanor Bones stood and walked toward him. Her light brown hair was tied in a loose bun that swayed as she moved, a little wispy fringe clinging at the ends. Her companion, Susan Payne, stayed seated clutching her skirt, her face tense and hesitant to cross the house divide. It was unusual for a Hufflepuff to approach the Slytherin table, but Eleanor walked straight over with composed steps, shoulders back and expression open. "Regulus." Eleanor stopped beside him and scanned him quickly, confirming he showed no signs of injury. A flicker of concern crossed her face before she smiled. "I saw what happened today. You were very calm. Most people would have started panicking long before. Her voice was clear and she didn't lower it unnecessarily. She even gave him a thumbs up. Pretty cool. Regulus looked up and sensed the sincerity in her gaze. He scooted over, making a space, and tapped the tabletop lightly with his fingertips. Want to sit? Eleanor shook her head and jerked her chin towards Susan. She's still over there. I just came over to ask if you were all right. Her gaze landed on his plate. Good to see you're fine. Hogsmeade was supposed to be a place to relax. She didn't linger, turning back and heading toward the Hufflepuff table with the same composed, unfazed gait, ignoring the curious looks. The Slytherins exchanged surprised glances. It was rare to see a Hufflepuff take the initiative like that. But this was Eleanor Bones. No one wanted to make a fuss over someone from the Bones family, given their influence at the Ministry. Regulus glanced across at the Gryffindor table. James Potter and Sirius were looking in his direction. When James saw him notice, he quickly averted his eyes and muttered something under his breath. By the movement of his mouth, it sounded like bragging that he himself would have managed to kill the Dark Wizard. He frowned indignantly and nudged Sirius with his elbow, fishing for agreement. Sirius, however, didn't look away. His gray eyes held a complicated mixture of curiosity and concern. Lily, sitting a little way back at the Gryffindor table, was stirring her pumpkin juice with a spoon. Regulus saw she was looking too and gave her a slight nod. If one were to pick the sort of stories that haunted the corridors, Regulus of Hogwarts, Lord of the Starry Sky, might be the title some would invent. When Regulus finished his meal, Professor Slughorn and Lucretius strode into the Great Hall together. The hem of Lucretius's dark green cloak swept the floor. Regulus had a feeling the professor had already put a few pieces together. Slughorn knew everyone, ministry officials, shopkeepers, and Nocturne Alley, and when two heirs were seen together in Hogsmeade, he could connect dots faster than most. They left the hall side by side and made for the potions classroom. When they knocked and went in, they found Slughorn seated in a large armchair with a steaming glass of mead. He waved them in, his familiar smile in place. Come in, boys. Freshly baked treats, still warm. Care for one? I asked the kitchen to save some. They used fresh butter. The flavor's quite good. Regulus and Lucretius exchanged a look and shook their heads. Regulus stepped up and stood politely before the desk. Professor, did you need us? Slughorn put down his glass. The smile was still on his face, but his eyes sharpened. Tell me, where did you two go today? Don't say you were just wandering around Hogsmeade. He leaned back, fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. When you two get together, it's never simple. Lucretius, you're heir to the Borgin house, and Regulus, you're the future of the Black family. You wouldn't be hanging out without a reason. Slughorn's connections ran wide. He could likely suss out the purpose of their outing from that alone. Regulus and Lucretius traded another glance. Lucretius answered first, steady and calm. We had some family matters to settle. We went to the Borgin and Burke shop in Hogsmeade to discuss some business arrangements. Slughorn nodded without pressing on specifics about the family business. Cooperatives between noble houses tended to be private. His tone softened. You weren't hurt, were you? What actually happened? Nobody's hurt, Regulus said. The Dark Wizard's wand was broken, so he wasn't much of a threat. Aurors arrived quickly. Slughorn listened, fingers still tapping. Then his expression shifted, a sly look in his eyes. The scent of Nocturne Alley doesn't come off easily. Neither boy answered. Slughorn looked closer at Lucretius, a satisfied look as if he'd guessed something. You didn't change your clothes, did you? I can smell dead leaf newt. That's a rare ingredient. Only a few shops in Nocturne Alley sell it. It's used for enhancing memory charms. It's not something you'd normally pick up. Lucretius's face remained impassive. He gave a slight nod. We did visit Borgin and Burke's to finalize some family business, and we left shortly afterward. Slughorn sighed, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Lucretius, you've grown up around that sort of thing. You've seen dark arts items enough that I'm not worried about you. But Regulus, it's too soon for you to be roaming Nocturne Alley. He continued, earnest now. There are all sorts of people there. Dark wizards, smugglers, even werewolves at times. One mistake and you attract trouble. I know it's for family reasons, but be more careful. Don't go alone. Take someone older. It's much safer. Both boys listened respectfully. Slughorn waved a hand, his tone lightening. All right, you're not children. You understand responsibilities, but your safety matters more. Be cautious, and if you can't solve something, come to me. As they turned to leave, Slughorn suddenly called out, Regulus, stay a moment. I want to speak with you privately. Chapter 91. A part of play, Lucretius turned and left tactfully, closing the office door behind him with a soft motion. Slughorn gestured for Regulus to sit, leaning forward to close the distance between them. The hearthlight caught on his round face, softening the sharpness of his usual expression. You're far more mature than children your age. I've never treated you like an ordinary student. His tone was genuine, his eyes warm with admiration. Your talent for potions, your gift for 38, and your composure are all well beyond the ordinary. You're destined for great things. Regulus inclined his head. Thank you, Professor. If you ever run into a problem you can't solve, don't hesitate to come to me. Slughorn smiled, pride evident as he began to outline his connections. I know quite a few people. High-ranking officials at the Ministry of Magic, several deputy ministers in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, or heads of old families like Abraxas of the Malfoys or Old Knot of the Knot family. If I speak up, they'll at least listen. He continued, even for rare potion ingredients, phoenix tail feathers, acromantula venom, or obscure 38 knowledge, I can usually find a way. Last year, a student wanted to study ancient runes, but couldn't find the proper texts. I managed to procure them through a friend in the Egyptian 38 world. Regulus felt something shift inside him. Slughorn was like an invisible web, sitting at the center of the 38 world, able to influence many interests. And the professor hadn't spoken to him like he was a child. He had meant it. It was clear Slughorn's dealings extended beyond the school. If the need arises, I won't stand on ceremony, Professor, Regulus replied with sincere gratitude. He knew he had long been one of Slughorn's favored collectibles. That was acceptable, so long as he stayed within bounds and didn't become gossip or a source of leaked intelligence. Slughorn chuckled. Good. He steered the conversation back to potions, growing serious. Your skill in potions is excellent. Your understanding of ingredients, your control of heat, your use of 38 all surpass your peers. Even upper-year students might not match you. The elixir of euphoria you brewed last time reached S level in purity and effect. In all my years, it's the first time I've seen a first-year achieve that. Then, assuming the stance of a master, he added with a touch of severity, but that's only an advantage at this stage. The potions you do well now mostly have fixed recipes and procedures. If you're careful and focused, you can follow them exactly. A true potioneer, though, needs creativity and intuition. It's the ability to adapt a recipe to a unique situation, or even to create a new potion. For instance, if you meet a patient with unusual needs and conventional potions fail, you must be able to improvise. Or if ingredients are scarce, you should know acceptable substitutes that won't compromise the effect. In that respect, you still have a long way to go. Regulus was surprised. He hadn't expected the professor to pinpoint that. His proficiency did rely on powerful 38 perception. He could precisely sense the 38 state and flow of ingredients and control every detail. But he lacked that creative spark, the soul a true master imparts to a potion. Slughorn's observation confirmed he truly was a master. I'll work hard, Regulus said earnestly. If the need arises, I may indeed trouble you, Professor. Slughorn nodded and waved a hand, returning to a gentler tone. Go on, keep it up. I have high hopes for you. Then, with a knowing look, he added, Hogwarts needs a student with your talent and composure, and the 38 world needs one too. Regulus rose to leave. The corridor outside the potions office was already dim. The torchlight had dwindled, and most portraits were fast asleep, except for one elderly wizard, dozing and muttering. He made his way toward the Slytherin common room. When he pushed the door open, he found Narcissa and two other seventh-year girls gathered around the hearth. Narcissa wore a silver dress with a small black family crest embroidered at the hem, reclining with an elegant grace. A steaming drink in her hand left tiny droplets on the cup. The other two girls wore deep blue and deep purple robes and chatted softly, their laughter a low, genteel sound befitting 29 witches. Seeing Regulus, Narcissa rose immediately and, with a polite smile to the others, said, "We'll talk later." The girls took the hint and left, nodding as they passed him. Just back from the professor's office, Narcissa led Regulus to the couch and sat beside him. She studied him with a hint of concern. "Were you affected by the Hogsmeade incident today?" Regulus relaxed. "It was just a dark wizard without much skill. Even if the Aurors hadn't arrived, I would have been fine." Narcissa smiled, the corners of her eyes softening. "I knew you could handle yourself." Father said the ministry has set up a special office for the detection and confiscation of counterfeit defensive spells and protective objects, led by Barty Crouch, Regulus said, his tone returning to calm. "I went to Borgin and Burke's today. They want to cooperate, trade a few high-risk items for our support in the Wizengamot over the next 3 years. Support in legislative votes, early warnings before broadened reviews, and endorsements at hearings when needed," he added, not hiding anything. Narcissa was of the Black family and was soon to be a Malfoy. She would learn these things sooner or later. "Father told me to observe. The final decisions will be his." Narcissa's smile dimmed a little. "Lucius says things outside are tense. Many plans are on hold. Barty Crouch is acting very harshly." She sipped her drink, the warmth relaxing her. "There's talk that someone in the ministry wants to target that lord, but to act now would be—" She trailed off, leaving the implication clear. Hardliners at the ministry wanted to check Lord Voldemort's rise, but they might not have the means or will to do so yet. Regulus thought that if they didn't act now, by the time Voldemort's power was fully established, the ministry might lack the courage. If the ministry couldn't withstand the pressure, Dumbledore would probably have to take the lead. They talked over a few family matters. Narcissa asked about his classes. Regulus mentioned Professor Flitwick's advanced charms seminar and Professor McGonagall's praise for his transfiguration. She listened, eyes shining with pride. He was her cousin and a future of the Black family. His achievements reflected on her and on the status she would hold in the Malfoy household. After about 15 minutes, Regulus excused himself and returned to the 30. Avery and Alex were already back, sitting on their beds and chatting. "Next Hogsmeade weekend, I'm having my family write me a permission slip." Avery slapped his thigh, face alight. "To run into a dark wizard hijacking in the flesh, that sort of thing only happens once in a lifetime. It's too exciting." "I want to see it too," he added. "Maybe I can meet an Auror and watch them arrest a dark wizard." Alex frowned at him. "Better not. It's too dangerous. This time, Regulus was lucky and the Aurors arrived fast. What if next time you meet someone stronger and they don't show up? Then what?" "It's only interesting because it's dangerous," Avery retorted. "A 29's dignity can't be lost. If you run away from every bit of trouble, what kind of image is that? If we're old and telling stories, everyone else will have thrilling tales, and I'll only be able to say I drank butterbeer in Hogsmeade." He puffed his chest out, but added, "Of course, if you really can't win, you run. Only a fool fights to the end." Alex was about to argue when Regulus entered. He stopped and asked curiously, "Regulus, if there hadn't been Aurors, what would you have done?" Avery leaned across the gap between the beds, eager. "What spell would you have used? Expelliarmus? A binding charm?" "I'd think a severing charm would be good," Alex chimed in, imagining tactics. "Break his 40 and render him useless in combat. Or blast a curse to create chaos and escape in the confusion," Avery said, growing more excited. "I think a blasting curse is most practical. It deters the opponent and gives you a chance to get away." "Perfect." Chapter 92. Hermes is doomed. Wednesday, 2 days after Hogsmeade, 2 o'clock in the morning. Regulus pushed open the door to the 21. The sound of his boots on the carpet was barely audible. He had just returned from the room of requirement. He hung his robe over the edge of his bed and found Avery and Alex both still awake. Avery leaned against the headboard, fingertips drumming the bed frame, brow knotted. Alex was curled under his quilt, clutching the corner of the blanket, eyes wide and alert. Regulus pulled up a chair and sat down, scanning them both. "What's wrong?" Avery stopped tapping, sat up, and his voice carried clear irritation. "Hermes is in the hospital wing. We went to see him this evening. He was still unconscious." "Madame Pomfrey wouldn't go into details," Alex added softly. "She just said he'll need treatment for a few days." Professor Slughorn went as well, Avery said, fists tightening. When he saw Hermes, he went pale. He said it was caused by dark arts. Regulus tapped his fingers on his knee without answering. Avery's anger hardened. That boy kept distancing himself from us, sneaking around at night. Who knows what he was up to? If something's happened to him now, he brought it on himself. But he's in our 21. If word gets out that someone could do this to one of us, people think we're soft. Alex peered out from under the quilt, his voice thin but resolute. Madame Pomfrey said that kind of dark arts is nasty. Hermes was pale as paper. We asked if we could help, and she told us to go back and wait for news. I think we need to find whoever did this. Otherwise, maybe next time it'll be one of us. Regulus watched them. Hermes was hurt. Avery's reaction sprang from instinct and reputation. He was Cuthbert, raised on 19 pride, and a hurt doormate was a violation of territory. Alex, from the weaker Rosier branch, was cautious by nature. His suggestion to hunt the culprit was driven as much by fear as by indignation. Regulus knew Alex had never liked Hermes. The boy's gloom made him unpopular, but that didn't matter now. Pieces fell into place in Regulus's mind. The Mulciber family had a reputation for studying dark arts. Hermes had been obsessed with them since he arrived at school. He'd left their group this term and had been wandering at night, either following family orders, reaching a critical point in whatever he was doing, or stumbling into danger. The internal politics of Slytherin were complicated. Small, extreme cliques versed in dark arts competed ruthlessly, hoarding knowledge and resources. Hermes might have crossed someone's interests while poking around the castle, been set up by a family task, or been the victim of an experiment that spiraled out of control. If he'd been targeted, the attacker wanted him out of the way to monopolize a discovery. Regulus's voice was steady as he spoke. Getting angry won't help. With Hermes unconscious, we don't have proof whether this was some practice gone wrong or a deliberate attack. Professor Slughorn's expression suggests the dark arts involved aren't ordinary. This wasn't something a typical student could handle. Finding the culprit will require evidence. Wild guesses will only reveal our movements and give whoever did this time to cover their tracks. Avery bristled. So we just wait. Tomorrow morning, we go to the hospital wing, Regulus said. Hermes's symptoms and Madame Pomfrey's diagnosis may tell us more. For now, keep steady. Don't talk about it in the common room. Don't let rumors spread and attract attention. There are people in Slytherin watching our 21. Don't give them an opening. Avery opened his mouth, then shut it. He knew Regulus was right. Rash action would only make things worse. Alex exhaled. His shoulders relaxed, and he murmured, Regulus lay back on the bed. He could hear Avery's shift and Alex's uncertain breathing. Neither slept, both stifling their frustration. He knew this wouldn't pass quietly. Tomorrow he would go to the hospital wing, check Hermes's condition, judge the nature of the injury, and if it was man-made, decide whether and how to intervene. Outside, the Black Lake rippled. Shadows swam across the glass. Green light fractured and reformed, painting shifting patterns on the stone. Avery finally stilled. Alex's breathing deepened into soft snoring. Regulus closed his eyes and sank inward. In the depths of his consciousness, the model of the 4.5 stars of 18-teen glowed. The position of 14-teen showed as a steady halo, not fully lit, but providing structural support for the system. Magic moved to the rhythm of those stars, tempering the body and consolidating the spirit. The Black Lake calmed, green light steadied. In the 21, there were 3 breaths, 2 sunk in sleep, 1 clear and rhythmic. Regulus stayed in meditation for 2 hours before letting his awareness rise and sleeping. When he woke, the common room still lay under the dark green light from the depths of the lake. Avery was already up, sitting at the edge of the bed and pulling on his robes faster than usual. Alex lay awake, staring at the ripples on the ceiling. "What time is it?" Regulus asked. 6:30, Avery said, voice hoarse. "The hospital wing opens for visits at 7. They dressed in silence. The fabric of their robes whispered. Silver buttons clicked. Regulus straightened his cuffs and tucked his 27 into his inner pocket with careful movements. Alex fumbled with his buttons and climbed down slowly. By the time they had washed, the common room had filled. The fireplace's magical flames had been stoked, casting orange-red light and dancing shadows over armchairs strewn with empty teacups and scraps of parchment from the night before. Avery paused at the door and looked back. "Are we just going like this?" "Otherwise," Regulus replied, "we're visiting a roommate. That's reason enough." Alex murmured. "Madame Pomfrey said not to disturb him last night." "We'll only stay a few minutes," Regulus said, and opened the common room door. The hospital wing sat on the first floor. The heavy door was carved with reliefs of healing 27s and medicine bottles. Regulus reached for the handle, but he felt Avery move to push and put a hand on his wrist. "I'll do it," he said, and knocked 3 times in a steady rhythm. Footsteps approached, and the door opened. Madame Pomfrey stood in the doorway in her white healer's coat over a night robe, hair neat though edged with exhaustion. "Mr. Black," she took in the 3 of them at once, "and Mr. Cuthbert, Mr. Rosier. It's early. The patient needs rest." "We won't stay long," Regulus said politely. "Hermes Mulciber is our roommate. We want to know how he is." Madame Pomfrey appraised them. After a few seconds, she stepped aside. 5 minutes. No noise. Do not touch the patient." They entered. The hospital wing smelled of disinfectant and a blend of potions. Curtains were drawn. Only a few 26 lamps gave soft light. Of the 6 beds set in 2 rows, only the one at the far end was occupied. White sheets and a white quilt covered Hermes, lying in the center. Regulus slowed as he approached. Hermes looked far worse than any of them had imagined. His skin was ashen, stretched over cheekbones. His eye sockets were hollow, lips cracked and peeling. His hair lay dull and lifeless against the pillow. Though his eyes were shut, his eyeballs moved rapidly beneath the lids, as if he were trapped in a nightmare. The quilt was pulled to his chest. Around his exposed neck and collarbones there were darkened patches like decay, the edges blurred and spreading into healthy skin. His forearms, visible beneath the quilt, bore dark gray, spiderweb-like patterns that traced along veins and spread in a winding lattice. At the intersections of the patterns, small ulcerations had been treated with herbal ointment. Regulus stopped 3 steps from the bed and did not move closer. He laid his senses open and let his probe. Internally, Hermes' 26 was weak and scattered. The core of it still ran, but the edges had frayed. The magic inside had broken into fragments, flowing chaotically. Over that, there was an external 26 on his body, something alien layered on top of his own magic, its pattern woven into the staining on his skin. The external 26 felt foreign and aggressive, not like a simple hex or a standard curse. It was intrusive, corrosive, more like an experiment's residue than a textbook slashing spell. Regulus cataloged it quickly, a fragmented internal power overwhelmed by a malignant overlay. It fit none of the neat categories the teachers used. This was messy and dangerous. Madame Pomfrey watched his face. Without moving closer, Regulus asked in a low voice, "Is he stable? Do you know what did this?" Her professional calm showed a hair of admitted uncertainty. "He's alive," she said softly, "but he's very ill. I can slow the spread and relieve pain, but I cannot say for certain what the exact cause is yet. There are traces of dark arts, yes. I've sent for Professor Slughorn and for further counsel. For now, he must rest." The 3 of them stood and listened, then quietly asked a few measured questions about what to expect. Madame Pomfrey answered only what she could, and when her 5 minutes were nearly up, she reminded them again not to disturb Hermes and to leave him in peace. Silently, Regulus took a last, careful look at Hermes, at the thin chest rising and falling, at the dark patterns crawling like ink under the skin. He felt the weight of the foreign Mayu, 26, still imprinted on his senses. When they stepped back into the corridor, the hospital wing door closed behind them, and Madame Pomfrey shut away the sight and the smell of medicines. Outside, the green light of the lake felt colder than usual. Regulus kept his expression unreadable, but inside his mind a plan was forming. If this had been inflicted intentionally, then whoever had done it had used something more than a schoolboy's jinx. They would need proof, and they would need discretion. For now, they would watch, gather information, and wait for the next move. Chapter 93, Team Building, starts from a young age. The moment Regulus sensed it, a chill ran down his spine. This was no ordinary dark arts. Ordinary dark magic was aggressive and destructive, with a clear direction and purpose. This, however, felt alive, taking root, spreading, devouring from within Hermes. Its nature was cold and viscous, saturated with despair, as intrinsic to it as poison is to venom. It reproduced inside Hermes's magical system, eroding his own magic with every passing second and feeding off it while releasing ever more despair. Regulus stood at the bedside, fingertips twitching as a very thin thread of that dark matter reached out. The instant it brushed Hermes's skin, it was met by a dense black aura. Mixed within it were thousands of wails of despair, as if countless people were writhing in pain. The sorrow had a bone-deep contagion that crawled along Hermes's magical channels like a living thing. With a thought, Regulus severed the thread. The mental barrier he'd erected with star orbit meditation flared to life, blocking the invading aura and dissolving it in a heartbeat. This appeared to be a ward perverted by the dark arts, twisted into something more like a curse. Hogwarts professors had countless remedies. A young student could break an arm, a leg, even their neck, and be mended as long as they hadn't died outright. Ordinary hexes were trivial for them. But a curse of this sophistication would demand the school's full attention. Avery stood beside Regulus, brow knitted so tight his anger nearly overflowed, though he forced it down, fists clenched. Can he? His voice quivered with rage. Can he still wake up? Madame Pomfrey came forward with a silver tray bearing several glass vials of oddly hued liquids. He can wake up, she said flatly. But it will take time. Curses like this have to be removed slowly. You can't rush them. What sort of curse is it? Regulus asked. Madame Pomfrey shot him a blunt look and refused to elaborate. That's not something you need to know. The professors will handle it. Alex stood nearby, eyes downcast, not daring to look at Hermes. His hands were jammed into his robe pockets. He shivered as if cold, and fear wrenched his face. Avery's Adam's apple bobbed. Who would use? I don't know, Pomfrey cut in. The professors are investigating. It's not for you to worry about. She turned to Regulus. Visiting hours are over. Go back to your lessons. Don't loiter here. Regulus inclined his head. Thank you, madam. He stepped away with Avery and Alex at his heels. At the door, he glanced back. Hermes lay on the white sheets like an unfinished corpse. A sliver of morning light pushed through a gap in the curtains and fell across the darkened patch on his neck. Its edges gleamed a sickly purple-black. A few Hufflepuffs hurried past the entrance to the hospital wing, breakfast bread in hand, their chatter ringing off the stone. Outside, Avery could no longer keep the words in and cursed under his breath. This is too far. To use something so sinister. Whoever did this, I'll find them. Alex nodded, voice still trembling. It's terrifying. Those markings looked horrible, if they'd been on us. Regulus ignored their outrage and fear. If Hermes had been hurt while exploring the castle on his own or carrying out a family errand, it would be his own fault. Regulus could simply let it go. But if he had been assaulted, the situation changed entirely. Hermes no longer traveled with their circle, but he belonged to the same Slytherin house and had worked with them last semester. An attack on him could be a provocation against them. If this had been done by someone, Regulus could use it to his advantage. Follow the trail, uncover the culprit and their motives, and consolidate his position while rooting out potential threats in Slytherin. He even found himself hoping the wound was man-made. That would give him a legitimate reason to intervene and investigate the dark ritual, a mystery infused with a despair unlike anything he'd encountered. He cut his gaze away and resumed walking. Let's go back to the dorm, he said. Avery and Alex followed. There was still time before class. Both wore complicated expressions, Avery raw with restrained fury, Alex shaken. Regulus, however, had already mapped out the next step. He remembered Hermes's map. It marked a room beneath the astronomy tower with a note, suspected entrance, needs verification. Hermes often took night walks. He'd probably been investigating that place. His injury was almost certainly connected to that entrance. Back in the Slytherin dormitory, Avery perched on the edge of his bed, pacing the problem and cursing from time to time. Alex sat at the desk, clutching a steaming cup of hot chocolate with both hands to steady himself. His eyes still brimmed with panic. Regulus stepped to Hermes's bed, unzipped the backpack, and found the map intact. The paper was yellowed and densely inked with the castle's local topography. Sure enough, beside the room under the astronomy tower, someone had added a hurried note in scrawled handwriting. Entrance confirmed. Protections active. Now weakening. Regulus replaced the map and looked at them. After class this afternoon, come with me to the astronomy tower. Avery straightened, eyes brightening. Why the astronomy tower? Is Hermes' condition linked to that place? Before his accident, he was investigating a hidden entrance beneath the astronomy tower. Regulus said simply, "We'll see for ourselves this afternoon." Alex paled and shook his head reflexively. "We have to go there? What if it's dangerous?" "Staying here isn't necessarily safer." Regulus fixed him with a steady look. "The only way to avoid ending up like Hermes is to find the truth. If you don't want that to happen, come with me." Alex opened his mouth as if to argue, then shut it. He sipped his hot chocolate and, under fear, accepted the plan. Avery, by contrast, rubbed his hands together with eager determination. "I'll go. Whoever hurts someone from our dorm won't get away with it." Regulus observed them and made a small private calculation. Team building. He didn't need their help as much as he needed them to be invested participants. Avery had the pedigree. He was the heir of the Cuthbert family, arrogant but respectful of power, already showing a tendency to follow a strong leader. Letting him act would deepen his loyalty and give Regulus a chance to evaluate his judgment and resolve under pressure. Alex, a branch rosier, was timid but meticulous. His sense of safety had been shaken by Hermes' attack. Seeing a danger controlled with his own eyes would foster trust in Regulus's ability to protect him. More importantly, it would be the first crisis the three of them faced together, an opportunity to test their coordination. Their presence would also allow corroboration of events and reduce the chance of later discrepancies or secrecy. If things went south, more people could provide distractions or early warnings and buy time to retreat. Lunch in the Great Hall was louder than usual. News had leaked to the Slytherin table. Whispers about Hermes' hospitalization mingled with curiosity, schadenfreude, and a thread of wariness. The three of them ate in silence. Avery kept glancing around, scanning the crowd for anything suspicious. Alex kept his head down and shoveled food into his mouth. Regulus cut his steak methodically, listening to the conversations like a hunter picking up breadcrumbs. Mentions of the dark arts, of late-night prowling. When they finished, the three went straight back to the dormitory. The plan for the afternoon already set. The afternoon history of magic felt interminable. Professor Binns floated behind the lectern, reciting the dates and casualty lists from 15th century rebellions in the same monotonous tone. Avery kept glancing out the window, impatience written across his face. Regulus, on the other hand, took notes methodically, at least by appearances, although his mind was arranging what he already knew about the astronomy tower. It was one of Hogwarts' oldest structures, dating back to the school's founding, and it sheltered more than a few secrets. Over the years, many headmasters had set protective wards there to keep students from wandering into dangerous places. When the bell finally rang, Avery jumped to his feet. "Quick, let's go." Regulus nodded. The three of them slipped out with the crowd, skirting the public corridors and taking a narrow path along the west side of the castle toward the astronomy tower. In the cold winter light, the tower rose like a jagged silhouette. Massive gray stones, smoothed by time, edges rounded, surfaces pitted and scored with erosion. Most of the ivy had withered, the rest clung in brittle strips, trembling in the wind. Below the tower, a lawn lay under a thin blanket of snow where a few small birds flitted restless in the trees. Regulus led them around to the tower's rear, where dense bushes nearly hid a narrow, almost forgotten path. Tucked behind the foliage was a wooden door that almost merged with the stone. The dark brown wood was twisted with grain like a contorted face. A rusty iron ring hung from the handle, and a brass padlock drooped from it. The lock cylinder had been melted, and the cooled brass had solidified around the keyhole in ugly, lumpy shapes. Regulus pushed the door open. Dust cascaded down in clouds, curling in the slant of the late sun. The room beyond was piled with discarded astronomical instruments. Brass sextants had gone green with corrosion, the engraved scales on the astrolabes were blurred, and a telescope lay snapped in two with glass shards scattered around. The dust on the flagstones was thick, but among it were crisp, fresh footprints. Several sets, the impressions distinct enough to have been made only in the past few days. Regulus walked to the far wall, where tangled vines mostly covered the stone. He pushed them aside and revealed a crudely carved opening, just wide enough for one person. When his fingers brushed the inner wall of the tunnel, he felt traces of wards that were still relatively fresh. Whoever had gotten in here had dismantled the protective charms slowly and precisely. It wasn't sloppy vandalism. Hermes' skill likely didn't reach that level. Either he had an accomplice with him, or the Mulciber family had provided specialized magic to help breach the wards. Regulus waved his hand, and the remaining vines fell away. "Go in," he said, and bent to enter the passage, Avery and Alex close behind. The corridor sloped down at about 15 degrees. Rough stone blocks formed the walls. Glowing moss crept from their crevices, casting a faint greenish light. The air was cold and damp, carrying a scent of earth and mildew. A pale ball of light bloomed at the tip of Regulus's wand, enough to make the floor visible without glaring in the narrow space. Ancient runes were carved into the stones, faded in places but still humming with a faint magical afterglow, clearly centuries old. Two sets of footprints tracked down the passage through the dust. One was smaller, the tread matching Hermes' boots at a glance. The other was larger, the steps steady and evenly deep. Regulus knelt and traced the bigger impressions with his fingers. His magical perception reached out and plucked at a faint residue. By the size and the quality of the trace, that second person was a 4th or 5th year, certainly not someone in the 6th year or higher. Older students carry a heavier texture to their magic. Their steps settle differently in the dust. "Two people have been here," Regulus said quietly. Besides Hermes, there was an upper-year accomplice, or a rival. Avery leaned in and frowned at the prince. "Do you think that person hurt him?" he asked. "It's possible," Regulus replied, and moved on. Alex pressed close to the wall behind them, eyes wide and fingers worrying the stone. "This place feels ancient," he muttered. "Are there traps?" The wards in the passage are mostly protective and misleading, not actively harmful. Regulus expanded his perception to a 10-meter radius. Whoever set them wanted to keep people out, not hurt them. But time and tampering had weakened those spells. The deeper they went, the dimmer the light, and the colder the air became. Forks in the passage multiplied, each branch humming with faint misdirection charms meant to send intruders wandering in circles. Regulus followed his sense of the wards and avoided the false paths again and again, staying on the true route. Avery stared at the labyrinth of tracks in the side passages. "How do you know which way to go? They all look the same. The wards are freshest this way." Regulus did not look back. Avery nodded, as if he understood, and kept his questions to himself. At last, they reached a massive stone door carved with a greater profusion of runes, twisted strokes, and unfamiliar variations woven into a complex sigil. Magic clung to the stone. Someone had tried to break the protections, but only partially succeeded. Regulus reached out and felt an invisible barrier that repelled his hand. The protective work here was advanced, carrying traces of secrecy spells, so elaborate it had something of the Fidelius charm's character. Only those who knew the secret could get through, and brute force would accomplish little. Beyond the door, Regulus caught a faint but ominous aura. It was dim, yet he recognized the same dark thread that had threaded through the curse on Hermes. Whatever lay past that door had likely been the source of Hermes' injury. Dangerous, dense, and eerie, it was not something to be handled lightly. Avery pushed at the door with both hands. "It won't even budge," he said angrily. "Should we try wards? Something to break it?" "No use." Regulus shook his head. "The protections are still in place and very powerful." Avery chewed his lip and toyed with his wand, trying to think of a way to force the barrier. Alex hugged himself, teeth chattering, his gaze darting toward the tunnel mouth as if already counting the steps to safety. The contrast in their temperaments was plain. Avery met danger head-on and wouldn't give up. Alex wanted only to get away as fast as possible. Regulus looked from one to the other. "We're going back." Avery bristled. "Why? We came all this way. Maybe if we keep at it. Whatever is behind that door is dangerous." Regulus was calm. "And there are two sets of footprints here. In addition to Hermes, there was another person. It's possible Hermes was set up. If we return now and wait, we can let things play out and draw the mastermind into the open." "A trap?" Avery's eyes lit up. "No need. Regulus said. "Word of Hermes being in the infirmary will spread. The person behind this will be watching. If we leave without leaving traces, the other side will make a move sooner or later, and then we can catch them." Relief washed across Alex's face. "Good. Let's get out of here." Regulus nodded and led them back up the passage. Avery and Alex followed close behind. The decision made, intelligence and patience, rather than a rash push into an unseen and perilous secret. Exiting the passage, Regulus cast an erasing charm over the footprints in the snow until no trace remained. He looked back at the hidden entrance once more, then waved his hand. The vine slid back into place, restoring the stone to its original, unremarkable face. Winter light in the Scottish Highlands was always brief. By the time they left the astronomy tower, the sky had already begun to dim. Back in the Slytherin common room, the fire in the hearth was roaring. A handful of fifth years were clustered on the sofa nearby, talking in low voices. When they saw Regulus and the others enter, their eyes flicked over them and then moved away as if nothing had happened. Regulus did not linger. He went straight to the dormitory. Avery kicked off his robes and tossed them on the bed, then looked up to speak, but Regulus raised a hand to stop him. "Don't tell anyone about what happened today." Avery opened his mouth, anger and worry mixing on his face. "This is serious." "Hermes was struck by a curse," Regulus said flatly. "If we start poking around now and a professor catches us, we'll have a very difficult time explaining ourselves. If the perpetrators find out we're looking, we could be next." He did not think the culprit would try to frame him, but Avery and Alex would be vulnerable. Avery's jaw clenched. He said nothing further. Alex went pale, his breath quickening. "Over the next few days," Regulus continued, "keep an eye on who goes to the hospital wing to visit Hermes. You don't need to interrogate anyone, just notice as you pass. Make a note of names and how often they come." "You mean," Alex's voice trembled, "the person who did this will visit him?" "They will," Regulus said. "Hermes is unconscious but not dead. That's an important difference. As long as he's alive, he might wake and say things he shouldn't. If there's another party involved, they'll want to know whether he can wake, when, in what condition. The hospital wing is the only place to get that information." Avery's eyes lit up. "So we just see who visits the most." "Or who behaves oddly during a visit," Regulus added. "Someone who deliberately avoids Madame Pomfrey, who lingers at the bedside too long, or who tries to touch Hermes when there's no reason to. That's suspicious." Alex swallowed. "Then we attend classes, live normally," Regulus said with steady authority. "Treat Hermes like a badly injured housemate. Visit when it's appropriate, worry when it's appropriate, but keep your eyes open." Avery punched his knee once hard. "Understood." After the two of them settled down, Regulus sat at his desk and let his mind walk over the facts. Hermes had been roaming at night since term began, probably on a family mission. The passage beneath the astronomy tower had been sealed for centuries, and the protective enchantments on the entrance were strong. The mission must have involved ancient secrets. There had been 2 sets of footprints at the scene, so at least 2 people were involved, either 2 families working together or 1 family sending 2 members. There was only 1 Mulciber in Slytherin, so it was likely cooperation between families. Hermes had been gravely injured but not killed. That suggested the attackers' goal was not necessarily to silence him forever, but perhaps to seize whatever he had discovered and stop him from going further. If 2 people explored together, one might have betrayed the other when they reached the objective, intending to keep the spoils. That would explain why Hermes had been incapacitated rather than murdered. The other party might have wanted him out of the way long enough to complete the final steps. But if Hermes survived and woke up, he could expose his accomplice. It was also possible that Hermes and his companion accidentally triggered a curse, and the companion fled in panic, either to save themselves or after failing to rescue him. Regulus considered what the professors might know. Slughorn had been to the hospital wing last night and likely identified the curse. But had any professor discovered the entrance under the astronomy tower? Dumbledore, as headmaster, would certainly be notified of anything major. If Hermes had been found inside the tower, they would have launched a thorough search. But what if he had been moved before anyone arrived? A corridor corner, an empty classroom. places easy to find but also quickly cleared of connections to the attacker. If the perpetrators wanted Hermes incapacitated but not dead, leaving him somewhere he could be found promptly made sense. It would let them sever their own ties while still ensuring he received treatment. If the professors were unaware of the astronomy tower entrance, that entrance was, for now, safe. Outside the tower window, a giant squid glided past, its tentacles brushing the glass. Green light fractured into a million pieces and danced across the walls. That was for the best. If the professors didn't know, the culprits would have to return to the tower to finish the mission, and they would. The job was almost complete. Regulus only needed to wait. He didn't have to break the entrance's protections himself, nor did he need to touch whatever danger lay beyond. He only needed to find the accomplice and follow them. Mr. Black, Mr. Cuthbert, Mr. Rosier, come to my office for a moment. After potions the next day, Professor Slughorn called them in. Avery and Alex exchanged looks. Regulus shoved his textbook and notes into his satchel, fastened it, and said, "Certainly, Professor." They followed Slughorn to his office. "Sit," he said, motioning to the high-backed chairs before his desk. He walked around and sat behind the desk, hands folded over his stomach. "I have a few questions about Hermes Mulciber." Avery straightened instantly. Alex looked at his shoes. Regulus kept his posture calm and measured, meeting Slughorn's gaze. "When did you last see Mr. Mulciber?" the professor asked casually, though his eyes were sharp. "The morning before last," Avery answered without hesitation. "In the common room, he said he was going to the library." "And you, Mr. Rosier?" I saw him the morning before last, too, in the dormitory, changing his robes before going out," Alex stammered. "Mr. Black?" Regulus paused briefly, then said, "I didn't see him the morning before last. The last time was 3 days ago, outside Charms." He hurried past without saying hello. Slughorn nodded. "Has Mr. Mulciber been acting differently lately? Mood swings? Unusual remarks?" Avery frowned. "He's always been gloomy and quiet. Did he mention going anywhere specific? Show any new interest in something?" Alex shook his head. Regulus did the same. Slughorn studied them for a long moment. The fire crackled, and a swooping evil larva rolled in its jar. "Children," he said, leaning forward until his voice dropped, "this is a serious matter. The curse on Mr. Mulciber is unusual. We don't want more students involved in danger. If you remember anything at all, come to me. Even the smallest clue could help." Regulus caught sight of Alex's lips moving as if about to speak and held his gaze. "Professor," he said, "we truly don't know anything. Hermes has been keeping to himself lately. He hardly talks." Slughorn relaxed back into his chair, fingertips tapping the desk. He let out a small sigh and a smile reappeared. "Very well. If you remember anything, come find me. You may go." Outside the office, Avery exhaled loudly. "Does he suspect us?" Alex whispered, glancing back at the closed door. Avery scowled. "Suspect what? That we did it?" "Just testing," Regulus said as they descended the spiral stair. "There's no evidence. Our stories match. Slughorn can't press us for what he doesn't have." "But we know nothing," Regulus interrupted, voice steady. "Remember that." For the next 2 days, they kept to the routine. Regulus woke at 7, washed, straightened his robes, and went to the great hall for breakfast. In Charms with Professor Flitwick, they practiced advanced applications of the levitation charm. Regulus sat in the front row, wand tracing a precise arc in the air. A heavy copy of Magical Theory rose from the shelf at the far end of the room and settled silently on his desk. "Perfect, Mr. Black!" Flitwick called from atop a stack of books. 5 points to Slytherin." After lunch came History of Magic. Professor Binns droned on about the Goblin rebellions, and Regulus took down dates and treaty names in his notebook while mentally adapting the shield charm he had been studying. If he wanted to change a shield from a simple barrier into a filter, letting harmless things through while blocking harmful spells, what structural adjustments would the magic need? He worked through the theory in his head until the bell. At 3 in the afternoon, he was promptly at the hospital wing entrance. When Madame Pomfrey saw him, her brow was still furrowed, but she didn't stop him. 5 minutes, she said. Regulus thanked her politely. "Thank you, madam." She waved him off and returned to her work. Hermes' condition was much the same as 2 days before. His skin was still ashen, The dark mottling across his neck and collarbone hadn't changed, and web-like patterns were slowly spreading along his arms. His breathing, however, was steadier, rhythmic now, and his eyes no longer darted wildly. He looked calm. Regulus stood at the foot of the bed, keeping his distance. He activated his magic perception. The curse inside Hermes remained active, but its progress seemed to have slowed. A gentle stream of restorative magic flowed across the surface of his skin, Madame Pomfrey's healing aura. He watched for 2 minutes, then left. On the afternoon of the third day, when he pushed open the hospital wing door, there was an extra person inside. Standing with his back to the door at Hermes' bed was a nearly 6-foot-tall man in a black robe. The fabric was silk, patterned in a dark, old-fashioned cut. Silver-threaded thorns were embroidered around the cuffs and collar. Regulus recognized the crest, the House of Mulciber. The light in the ward seemed to drink the fabric. It reflected almost nothing. The man turned at the sound of the door. Ebros Mulciber's face looked as if it had been carved. High cheekbones, deep-set sockets, gray-brown eyes that narrowed when he looked at someone, as if searching their throat. Thin lips, the corners of his mouth naturally downturned, gave him a slightly sinister air even at rest. He carried with him that chill detachment common to those steeped in the dark arts, an alienation from life that felt oppressive. Regulus stopped in the doorway and inclined his head. "Mr. Mulciber." Ebros studied him, eyes sliding from Regulus's face to the House of Black crest and back. "The younger son of House Black," he said in a low, rasping voice. "Regulus." "Yes, Mr. Mulciber." Regulus kept his nod steady. "Hermes mentioned you." Ebros looked away and returned his attention to the bed. "He said you were different." Regulus said nothing. He stepped a few paces closer and stopped beside Ebros. "How is Hermes?" "He will wake," Ebros answered flatly, staring at Hermes with no visible feeling. He took a small crystal vial from an inner pocket. A viscous, deep purple liquid swirled inside, and fine golden specks caught the light on the surface. "A family potion," he added. "Combined with Madame Pomfrey's treatments, it should clear the curse within 3 days." Regulus stared at the vial as the liquid ebbed slowly against the glass. "Unlucky," he said, "to run into something so dangerous wandering around at night." Ebros absently rubbed a thumb along the crystal and didn't reply. "I thought he'd be more careful," Regulus said, the concern in his voice like that of a classmate. "There have always been legends of ancient wards around the astronomy tower. It's easy to get into trouble if you go in without permission." Ebros paused, then turned his head slowly. His narrowed eyes sharpened. "The astronomy tower? Isn't that what people say at the castle?" Regulus met his gaze evenly. "They say a chamber of secrets from the school's founding lies beneath the astronomy tower, protected by ancient magic. Intruders get cursed." Silence fell. Only Hermes's shallow breathing and the distant clatter of Madame Pomfrey tidying the cabinet could be heard. Ebros watched Regulus with his lips pressed thin. After a few seconds, he set the crystal vial on the bedside table. "Hogwarts has many legends," he said without inflection. "Most are to frighten children." "That's true." Regulus inclined his head. "Where was Hermes found?" "The 4th floor east corridor, at the entrance to the abandoned armor display room," Ebros said. "I assume he was looking for a place to practice and ran into something he shouldn't have." "How unfortunate." Regulus shook his head with a small show of regret. Ebros simply nodded, displeased with his son's carelessness. The conversation ended. Ebros clearly had no intention of saying more. He checked a pocket watch, nodded to Regulus, and announced, "I must be going. Give my regards to Orion." "I will, sir." Ebros walked away, the hem of his robe whispering against the stone floor. At the door, he paused and glanced back. Regulus read the look as a warning. Something else was in it too, unreadable. The door closed. Regulus's eyes stayed on the crystal vial a moment longer. The deep purple liquid gleamed with an unsettling light. Ebros knew about the astronomy tower. No surprise. Hermes' excursion may even have been authorized by him. Ebros knew the nature of the curse. The potion he'd brought had a targeted effect. And Ebros was hiding something. He had told them where Hermes had been found, but named no accomplices and no perpetrator. If there had been obvious culprits, the school would have responded differently. Outside, the sky was already leaning toward evening. Regulus walked down the stone steps toward the dungeons, turning the facts over. Ebros's arrival changed the timeline. Hermes' recovery would be sped up. That was dangerous for whoever was pulling strings. The sooner Hermes woke, the greater the risk that the truth would come out. What would the mastermind do? Wait and hope Hermes stayed silent? Ensure Hermes never woke? Rush to finish whatever lay beneath the astronomy tower and take whatever they could before anyone else found out? If the person behind everything wanted to cover their tracks, the most rational move would be to act quickly. That night, Regulus began preparations. He set warning charms along the routes someone would take from the common rooms to the astronomy tower. He'd read an old note in the library about tracking magical signatures, spells that could be configured by time, path, and signature threshold. Anyone who matched the criteria on contact would trigger an alert. He planted one at the corner of the moving staircase near Gryffindor Tower, another in the corridor outside the Ravenclaw astronomy classroom, and a third beside the portrait at the entrance to the Hufflepuff kitchens. For Slytherin, he set charms at the entrance to the common room, at the dormitory passage entrance, and at the bottom of the main staircase leading up through the castle. The setup took 2.5 hours. By the time he returned to the dormitory, it was nearly midnight. Avery and Alex were asleep, breathing evenly. Regulus lay down, closed his eyes, and sank his consciousness inward. The 4.5-star model of Orion on his bedside lit up in the dark. The halo at Rigel's position burned steadier than it had 3 days earlier, its edges clearer. His magical energy followed the astral trajectories. With each completed circuit, his physical and mental reserves increased a little. He maintained the trance for 3 hours, then eased his awareness back and fell asleep. He woke at 2:17 a.m. with a faint, needle-like sting in the inside of his left arm, the feel of a triggered warning charm. The alert had gone off in the Slytherin common room. He opened his eyes and listened. The dormitory was quiet, save for Avery's snoring and Alex turning in his sleep. He sat up, felt for his wand beside the pillow, and slipped a disillusionment charm over himself. His outline blurred and merged with the darkness. He eased the dormitory door open and moved into the common room. The fire had burned down to embers, only dark red coals remaining that popped and threw up an occasional spark. The room was empty, save for a few askew armchairs and some parchment and empty cups on the coffee table. On the rug by the fireplace were 2 fifth years, a boy and a girl. The boy had his back to Regulus. The girl leaned against him, bodies pressed close, their heads bent together as soft sucking noises came from between them. Her hands fumbled at his collar, while his arms were wrapped around her waist, his fingers digging into the fabric. Regulus stood and watched for 2 seconds, then turned and slipped back to the dormitory. He closed the door, dispelled the disillusionment charm, and lay down again. The prickling at his arm faded. The charm had been tripped by those two, not by anyone headed toward the astronomy tower. He closed his eyes. A trivial thought intruded. 5th year, owls coming up, and they're not studying or even sleeping. They're making out in the common room. So idle. Chapter 97. Forcing you to make a choice. Regulus lay in the dark, the heavy dark green curtains drawn around the bed to make a private room that shut out the world. Only his steady breathing and the faint ticking of a pocket watch on the pillow kept him company. His eyes were open. In the dimness, his pupils slowly widened. Abros Mulciber's last look kept surfacing in his mind. A warning, but why? Hermes had been struck down, the mission stalled at the last step, and he himself was out of the game. Abros had arrived with the family's potion, which would speed up Hermes' recovery. The doctor's treatment meant Hermes might wake within days. Whoever was working in the shadows had only a little time. They needed to finish their search before Hermes woke and spoke, or make sure he never did. Yet Abros had gone along with that clumsy story about the 4th-floor armory. The astronomy tower was in the west wing. The 4th floor lay on the east side, almost across the whole castle. Dragging an unconscious man that far wasn't just to get him medical care in time. It could only be a diversion. Abros knew about the astronomy tower, but he'd kept silent. He knew who the accomplice was, and still he wouldn't say. He would rather leave his son in bed and let the culprit keep roaming free, perhaps even watch them take what Hermes had been after, right from behind that stone door. It didn't make sense, unless taking the prize outright was somehow useful to the House of Mulciber, or unless the cost of preventing it was worse than letting it go. Two possibilities came to mind. First, Abros planned to let the other side take the item from Hogwarts and snatch it back outside the school. Families fell out all the time. Betrayals and counter-betrayals were common. Once the object left the castle, reached Nocturne Alley or someone's private vault, it would be far easier to reclaim. That would be the moment to settle scores. The son's injuries, the family's shame, all repaid with interest. Second, Abros didn't dare expose them. The person behind the culprit might be someone the Mulcibers couldn't afford to offend. It didn't have to be another family. It could be a higher authority pressing down, a secret society, or a powerful figure in pure-blood circles whose word outweighed a family head's. Hermes's injury could be the price to pay, the mission's continuation, an order he had to carry out. He stopped. These weren't complex deductions. If he could think of them, so could Slughorn and Dumbledore. Slughorn's questions in his office, his warnings about strange happenings. In retrospect, every word had meaning, and everything odd in the castle eventually reached Dumbledore's notice. Yet the headmaster hadn't moved. Why? Either Dumbledore judged this a student's quarrel not worth his intervention, or he was waiting for the forces behind the scenes to reveal themselves, for the cracks among the pure-blood houses to widen, for whatever roots had been growing in the dark to be exposed to sunlight. If the latter was true, then what Regulus and the others were doing might be following a path tacitly permitted by the headmaster. On the fifth morning, Avery woke to the sound of Alex tugging on his shoes. He grumbled and rolled over, reaching for the pocket watch on the bedside table even before he opened his eyes. Regulus was already at the desk. Outside the window, the black lake lay dull and gray. Now and then a bioluminescent jellyfish drifted past, its green glow breaking into flecks on the rippling surface. Avery sat up and raked a hand through his messy hair. "Going to the hospital wing again today?" "Not going," Regulus said, turning to them. "Abros is here. If the accomplice isn't a fool, they won't risk going back. Besides, Hermes might wake in the next 2 or 3 days. Time's running out for the other side." Avery's eyes brightened. "So they'll move soon?" "Maybe." Regulus nodded. Alex looked up at Regulus, pressing his lips together as if he wanted to speak but unsure how to begin. Regulus met his gaze and waited. After a moment, Alex finally said, voice small, "There's someone who goes to the hospital wing to see Hermes every day." Regulus inclined his head for him to continue. "It's like a normal visit," Alex went on. "They stand by the bed for a bit and leave without saying anything." Alex's voice was thin. "But after Mr. Mulciber came yesterday, that person didn't go." "Who?" Regulus asked. "Darren McNeil, 4th year." Avery smoothed his robes, frowning. "From the McNeil family? Aren't they the ones who deal in dark arts artifacts and old ruins?" Regulus leaned back in the chair and tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest. The McNeils had built their reputation by studying and handling dangerous dark arts objects and ancient enchantments. Several shops in Nocturne Alley relied on them, and a sizable portion of the cursed goods in Borgin and Berks had passed through their hands. Darren McNeil was the second son of the current generation. The eldest had died in an experiment a few years back, a fact the Daily Prophet had printed. Privately, pure-blood circles whispered darker versions. In any case, Darren now functioned as the heir, and family attention and resources leaned toward him. The Mulcibers were also known for research into the dark arts. Their focuses differed, but they overlapped. If two families worked together outside Hogwarts, exploring an old ruin or investigating the remaining lab of some dark arts master, it would make sense for family members who happened to be students at school to cooperate. If they found a clue pointing to something under the astronomy tower, sending their students to help would be logical. Cooperation until one side betrayed the other to keep everything for themselves was hardly unheard of among the pure-blood families. Regulus looked at Alex. This discovery could be very important. "Well done," he added. Alex visibly relaxed a fraction. A small light flickered in his eyes. Avery was already pacing by the sofa, clenching and unclenching his fists. "I knew it. They've been acting gloomy all day, poking around with broken boxes and rotten jars." "Speculation," Regulus cut in. "We have no proof yet." What more proof do we need? Avery snapped. He avoided Abros. Isn't that suspicious? A guilty conscience can mean many things, Regulus said evenly. Maybe he didn't want to make things worse, or maybe he wasn't involved at all and simply didn't go yesterday by chance. We need decisive evidence, not guesses. Avery fell silent. Alex's fingers twisted together. After a few seconds, he asked, quieter than before, "Then, shouldn't we tell Professor Slughorn?" Avery spun toward him. "Tell the professor? And then what? Have him question McNeil, give him a detention or two, and then nothing happens. What about the thing behind the stone door? Don't you want to know what's inside?" Alex went pale, his hands tightening. After another long silence, he whispered, "I don't want to know." It was true. Regulus could see the fear in Alex's face, fear of the unknown, of whatever might shatter the fragile peace of his life. Even so, Alex looked at Regulus as if waiting for a decision. Regulus neither encouraged nor stopped him. He stood, and the hem of his robe whispered against the floor as he moved to the window, his back to the others. He studied his reflection in the glass. "Avery's right," he said, turning back. "If we tell the professor, this ends here." He met Alex's eyes. "You can back out, go to class, eat, do your homework, pretend nothing happened. Whatever comes next won't involve you." Alex froze. His lips trembled. His gaze flicked from Regulus to Avery and then down to his own hands. After a long moment, long enough for Avery's impatience to show, Alex looked up. "I'll go with you," he said. His voice was barely more than a whisper and still shook. Regulus nodded and said nothing more. Chapter 98, Stalking at Midnight. "Darren McNeil is now a primary target for observation," Regulus instructed them. "For the next 2 nights, stay alert even while you sleep. If he moves in the middle of the night, we follow him." Avery nodded hard, his fist thudding on his knee. Alex nodded too, more subtly, but without hesitation. "Remember," Regulus said, looking at both of them, "follow my lead in everything. If I say retreat, you retreat immediately." "Understood," Avery replied. Alex made a small affirmative sound. Regulus didn't sleep deeply that night. His consciousness hovered on the edge between wakefulness and slumber. The warning spell on the inside of his left arm prickled every half hour. A self-check to confirm the connection remained active. At 1:10 a.m., the spell triggered. Regulus opened his eyes and lay still for 3 seconds to make sure it wasn't a false alarm, then sat up and called, "Avery, Alex." There was rustling from both beds. Avery practically sprang up. Alex moved a little slower. "There's movement outside," Regulus said, already reaching for the 22 beside his pillow. "I'll check it. Get ready." He did not wait for an answer. He tapped himself with the tip of his tutu, and the disillusionment charm flowed over him like a cool sheet of water. The outlines of his form blurred and distorted until he dissolved into the darkness. Pushing the dormitory door open, he saw a figure by the entrance. Darren McNeil, cloaked in thick black robes that seemed to drink in the dim light. In his right hand he held a black wooden box about the size of a palm, its lid shut tight. Regulus stopped at the doorway and breathed evenly, extending his magic perception toward Darren. At 5 meters, he caught the fluctuations of magic coming from the box. Ancient, stagnant, slow, but powerful. It was eerily similar to the protective spell on the stone door beneath the astronomy tower, likely the same origin, like 2 branches of the same tree. Regulus withdrew his perception and stepped back into the dormitory hallway. By the time the disillusionment charm lifted, Avery and Alex were already dressed and by their beds, 22 in hand. Avery's eyes glinted in the dark. Alex's lips were thin. "It's Darren McNeil," Regulus whispered. "He's carrying something like the protective spell under the astronomy tower. He's moving tonight. Follow him now." Regulus raised his 22, pointing first at Avery and then at Alex. A modified disillusionment charm swept over them, and they watched their bodies blur. Arms, torsos, legs fading into faint, almost transparent silhouettes. In the dim light, they could still make each other out at close range. "Don't make a sound. Keep your footsteps light and stay close to me," Regulus said, reapplying the charm to himself. Avery nodded. Alex mirrored him. The 3 of them slipped through the dormitory into the common room. Darren was gone. Regulus nodded once and slipped outside. The corridor was empty. Torches crackled, throwing long, flickering shadows. About 20 meters ahead, a dark figure moved briskly toward the stairs, the hem of his robes fluttering. Follow him. Darren's path was deliberate. Leaving the dungeons where the Slytherin common room lay, he turned onto a secluded side passage, the route to the East Wing's third floor 3, a way rarely taken at night, with few portraits and almost no passers-by. Regulus trailed about 15 meters behind, Avery and Alex 3 steps behind him. Not a footstep nor a breath betrayed them. The modified disillusionment charm was stronger than the standard version. It didn't just blur light, it absorbed sound, masked body heat, and suppressed minor magical leakage. Regulus had deliberately not told Avery and Alex everything about it. Too much knowledge could breed carelessness. They crossed the main building and took the spiral staircase toward the astronomy tower. Moonlight slanted through the high windows, laying bands of silver and shadow across the steps. Darren's shadow crawled along the wall. He stopped every dozen steps or so to glance back. Regulus halted each time and pressed himself into the darker parts of the wall. Avery and Alex mirrored his motions, hugging corners where the moonlight couldn't reach. Darren passed a corridor lined with old portraits, the painted figures apparently asleep, even snoring. He climbed a spiral stone staircase into the West Tower, the astronomy tower, and after a while descended again, arriving at the base of the tower. The wooden door at the tower's root was slightly ajar. When Darren pushed it open, the hinges gave an aged groan. Regulus paused outside the door, counted 3 heartbeats, then slipped inside. He raised a hand, signaling the 2 behind him to stop. The smell of dust in the 2 was thick. Moonlight poured through a broken window, illuminating suspended motes. Darren had already reached the far stone wall and was pushing aside dead vines. Behind them, an entrance yawned, dark and hollow. Darren clutched the box to his chest and bent down to enter the opening, moving with a certain awkwardness. Regulus waited until his footsteps faded and grew muffled down the passage, then motioned Avery and Alex to follow. The tunnel smelled damp and earthy, with a faint fishy moss scent. Luminous moss gave off a soft green light, casting shifting patches across the stone. Darren's footsteps echoed ahead, distinct. He hadn't bothered to muffle them. He apparently assumed no one would be following at that hour. Regulus kept a 10-meter distance and pushed his magic perception forward. He saw Darren's magical outline, taut and hurried. The box's abnormal fluctuations resonated with the ancient 18 runes carved into the passage walls. The passage wound downward, crossing junctions and stretching on for a long time. When they reached the heavy stone door, Darren stopped. He raised his 22. A pale ball of light bloomed at its tip and traced the twisted teen on the door. In that glow, the characters seemed to writhe slightly on the stone. Darren held the box for a moment, then opened it. Inside, deep purple velvet cradled a fist-sized crystal. A mass of gray mist swirled within the crystal. Now and then, face-like outlines surfaced, distorted features, wide screaming mouths that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Darren inhaled sharply, his chest rising. He held the crystal with both hands and lifted it out before the stone door, arms extended. He spoke the first word in a hoarse, ancient tongue. The syllables were forced from deep in his throat, rough and heavy, each one striking the air like a pebble dropped into still water and sending ripples outward. Regulus stopped in a nearby corner and held Avery and Alex back. He raised his left hand, fingers splayed. As magic gathered in his palm, he prepared to form a variant of the shield charm, a 16. He had only recently worked out the theory for it. Instead of a blanket block, it identified magical attributes and blocked only fluctuations with malicious or cursed properties, allowing benign magic to pass. Its strength was catching insidious, often overlooked fatal factors. He reminded himself how dangerous 20s could be. The drawback was the extreme precision it demanded, but he could manage that. He didn't know what lay behind the door, and Hermes Mulciber's curse had already proven the stakes. He had come to observe and gather information, not to gamble with their lives. If things went wrong, retreat would be his priority. Curiosity was fine, but you only had one life, a lesson he had learned well in the life before. Darren's incantation speeded up. The ancient language seemed to have texture. Each syllable sent a ring of ripples through the air that hit the stone and bounced back, layering echoes in the passage. The 18 on the stone door flared, first a dull red, then deep purple, finally settling into an ominous gray-black. The gray mist in the crystal began to roil. It pounded the inner walls of the crystal until fine cracks spidered across its surface. Cold sweat beaded on Darren's forehead and ran down to drip onto the collar of his robes. His knuckles went white around the crystal, tinged with blue, and his arms trembled. He gritted his teeth. A faint clicking from his jaw accompanied the final stretched syllable. The sound trailed off and lingered in the passage for 3 seconds. The stone door shuddered.